Good evening and welcome to the October 2nd, 2017 regular meeting of the Mayor and City Council. First item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. I'd like to ask our friend John Morgiello to come up to the podium and lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much, John. Next on our agenda is reflection. I know I speak for everybody up here when I say our hearts are very heavy for our brothers and sisters out in Las Vegas and the horrific event that happened there overnight. And so I'd like to ask for a moment of silence. Thank you very much. Next, we have approval of minutes. We have one set of minutes tonight to approve, being from the Monday, September 18th regular meeting. What's the pleasure of the council?
Mr. Mayor, I'll move approval of those minutes, September 18th, 2017.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, carries unanimously. Next, we have presentations, and let's see, I'd like to invite Judith Clark from Women Who Care Ministries and Vivian Levy from Family Services, who's director of the county's domestic violence shelter, to meet me at the podium. Okay, October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Gaithersburg is committed to supporting the prevention of domestic violence and assisting those throughout our community who directly and indirectly suffer from its devastating effects. The city is also committed to empowerment programs that support the positive educational and social development of youth to help combat the cyclical nature of domestic violence. The 11th annual Restore the Joy Domestic Violence Awareness Luncheon is taking place on October 7th, Saturday. It features a dialogue with a panel of experts, resource fair, and inspirational presentations. So we have a proclamation. And I'm going to read it and then invite these ladies to say a few words. Proclamation of the Mayor and City Council of Gaithersburg. Whereas domestic violence is an unspeakable offense against human dignity that shatters lives and and families and can produce lifelong feelings of hopelessness and despair. And whereas the ramifications of domestic violence are significant, young women are among the most vulnerable, and children who experience domestic violence are at a higher risk for failure in school, emotional and substance use disorders, and are more likely to perpetuate the cycle of violence as adults. And whereas the City of Gaithersburg is committed to and supports important partnerships that have been formed with victim services, criminal and juvenile justice agencies, healthcare providers, allied professionals, and providers of positive youth development programs to assist victims and those exposed to domestic violence and to help break the cycle of abuse. Now, therefore, I, Judd Ashman, by the power vested in me as Mayor of Gaithersburg, do hereby proclaim October 2017 as Domestic Violence Awareness Month throughout the City of Gaithersburg, calling upon all residents to speak out against domestic violence and support local efforts to assist victims and their families in finding the help and healing they need. Proclaimed this second day of October 2017, signed by me, and I want to thank these ladies for accepting this proclamation. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Please.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Vivian Levy. I'm the
director of the Domestic Violence Shelter in Montgomery County, a program that's funded by Montgomery County government and by small funders like Gaithersburg CD is helping out this year. We serve about 200 women a year, and about 350 children come to us every year. Our mission is to provide a safe space for families to manage their crisis and develop a plan for safety. Our survivors face countless challenges when they come to the shelter, from trauma to health issues and often homelessness. We hope that the shelter offers a respite and hope for a better future. We thank the city for the endless support, and we look forward to future collaborations with the community so we can reduce the number of violent incidents and increase hope for a better future. And something a little bit anecdotal, this morning I was meeting with a client and I was telling her, this month I'm very busy, I don't have much time to meet with you. And she said, why? I said, well, because, October is Domestic Violence Month, I have a lot of events to go to. And then she said, that's very ironic. She said, I experience domestic violence every day. You guys only commemorate it once a year. So having said that, thank you very much.
Did you want to say a few words?
Sure, just a few. Just want to say hi to everyone and to say that although domestic violence is so sad, at Women of Care Ministries, we're glad that we are in the solution, that we are operating with some very valuable tools to stop domestic violence. And not only with women, but what we're doing now in the past couple of years, our focus has been specifically on younger girls and guys at the onset or even before they begin dating, to help them to recognize the signs of domestic violence, because we can end domestic violence. It's just a matter of having the right resources, the right information in advance, and the right members of the community who have a heart and share a passion for helping to end domestic violence. So we're grateful that we're always connected with the City of Gaithersburg, not just at our annual Restore the Joy event, but we're looking forward to deeper partnerships with Gaithersburg going forward, and we're looking forward to deeper partnerships with the Betty Ann Crinkey Shelter, working together. It takes a village to help end domestic violence, and so we're grateful to be able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next on our agenda is public comments. This is the time when the mayor and council would like to hear from anybody who'd like to speak on a topic that's not a public hearing topic. Tonight we have 3 public hearings. I think they're all, let me just see. One of our public hearings is about home daycare. The others are about telecommunications. So if you're here to speak on any of those topics, just hold on. You'll get your time. If you're here to speak about anything else, this is the time. We ask that you state your name and address or neighborhood for the record. Keep your remarks to no more than 3 minutes. When your time's down to 30 seconds, the timer will beep and turn yellow. When your time's up, it will beep and turn red. Who would like to be our first speaker this evening? Please, come on up, John.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, and staff. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you tonight. My name is John Mortagello, and I'm the Artistic Director of Best Medicine Rep, a 501c3 nonprofit professional theater company here in Gaithersburg. Best Medicine Rep specializes in the development and production of new comedies, and it is dedicated to the artistic, educational, and cultural development of the Gaithersburg and Montgomery Village areas. We are here to entertain, to bring joy, and to foster community. We began programming in January with a monthly series of play readings in the community room of the Lake Forest Mall. We used paid professional union actors, directors, and playwrights to present these performances free to the general public. The reading series generated mention in local theater blogs and the Washington Post, drawing audiences from as far away as Northern Virginia. In April, we produced New Plays, New Voices, an evening of plays written by Montgomery County students through the Maryland State Arts Council's Artist in Residence program. Last year, I taught playwriting in 7 different elementary schools throughout the county, integrating my art form with the general curriculum and attempting to reach those students who learn differently. The success of New Plays, New Voices permitted us to expand into 11 schools this year, reaching over 1,000 students. In July, we presented our first full production at the Capitol Fringe Festival in Washington, garnering a 4-star review, sold-out houses, and an extended run. In September, a play reading at the Kennedy Center was sold out, where we crammed 15 people into a 40-seat space and still turned 20 people away, including a critic, and one of our board members. The critic, by the way, gave us a good review in absentia. I don't know how that worked. As we enter our second year, Best Medicine Rep is faced with tremendous opportunities and tremendous challenges. Our monthly play reading series begins again this Sunday at 3 o'clock in the community room, so be sure to hit Oktoberfest early before heading over to the mall to see Robin Rothstein's hilarious comedy Derek Jeter Makes the Play. But this is why I'm here tonight. 2 weeks ago, Best Medicine Rep reached an agreement in principle to lease a storefront to produce a season of full productions. Once our use and occupancy permit is approved, we will have a home from January through June of 2018. With that 6-month lease, we can provide classes for students and seniors. We can bring 3,000 people to that shopping center, and we can ensure that the residents of Maryland's 4th largest city won't have to leave town for entertainment. In fact, from out of town people will come here. Converting a storefront into a theater is a costly operation. We ask your help. Because the lease is so short, we realize that making the conversion permanent would not be economically viable for anyone. Therefore, we hope to make Best Medicine Rep a pop-up theater, portable enough to go into any neighborhood where there is an empty storefront for 6 to 9 months, but permanent enough to establish an audience for our work. Thank you very much.
And John, just to be clear,
Yeah.
the storefront is, or your location is at Lake Forest Mall, correct?
It is the Lake Forest Mall. It's the old KB Toys area. It's 4,600 square feet. We don't know what's going to happen to us after that 6 months, which is why we're hoping to make this portable enough so that we can move to wherever there is empty storefront space throughout Gaithersburg. I've given you a full copy of our proposal
Excellent.
for you to look at.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's very exciting news. Thank you for sharing with us. Do we have any other speakers tonight for public comment? Come on up. Good to see you, Steve.
Nice to see you. Might as well get the local nonprofits out of the way. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I am Steve Augustino from the Gaithersburg High School Education Foundation. I have no prepared remarks. I actually just want to say that I was very, very pleased to see the electronic message sign finally installed on Education Boulevard. You know it's been a long, long time to try to get that. There have been some ups and downs with that. I've been very frustrated at a number of times on that, but we are happy to see it up. We are happy to see it installed. It will benefit the community, the students at Gaithersburg High School with their ability now to communicate the many, many activities that are going on at the high school. It will be very prominent now. Everybody is excited to see it. We're excited to have it. I want to thank the city for working with us. As you know, others may not know, but Gaithersburg High School Education Foundation provided the funds for the Gaithersburg High School portion of that sign, so we donated that to MCPS. But I'm happy that I had cooperation all throughout the city for this, particularly with Michelle Potter and her group in trying to really push this thing forward and make this happen. So I want to thank you all for that, and we look forward to seeing you perhaps at our gala on November 11th. Thank you.
Steve, thank you so much. We're excited about the sign as well, and we appreciate what the foundation contributed to that, and we're glad the process finally came to fruition. So, do we have any other speakers tonight under public comments? Come on up.
It's been 18 years since I've been in this room. My name's Alan Frazier. Used to be on your planning commission and Board of Appeals. I'm here tonight as a public citizen. There's a bridge that I go under.
Do you, Alan, just either state your address or your neighborhood?
West Riding.
Okay, that's perfect.
Mike's neighborhood.
Okay. Not only Mike's, but
Not all of it. There's a bridge that I go under almost every day, and it's the CSX bridge. And I'm here to speak on behalf of citizens, maybe 10,000 of them that go under that bridge every day. If y'all haven't been under it recently, I commend it to your attention. Russ Bucket would be kind to speak of this bridge. I can't think of anything else in Gaithersburg that looks as unkept and is seen by the public so much as this bridge. I can't tell you who's responsible for keeping it up. I've tried to work with your maintenance department, your planning commission. I have the utmost respect for what the city does. And thank you for Watkins Mill and the fact that Mike has on his little brochure said it's coming. I can see it. I saw the clear cut and I said, ha, it's finally here. I left the planning commission in 1996 when they were talking about it. That's how slow things go. This bridge that I'm talking about, it's on Route 124. It's a state road. It's a CSX bridge. Passenger trains go over that. Freight trains go over it. I'm concerned about two things. It looks ugly. There's more rust on it than paint. The other thing I'm concerned about is the folks going over it. Rust usually leads to, and lack of maintenance usually leads to trouble. This isn't exactly on the city border, it's well within the city. I don't assign responsibility to anybody. I'd like to know who the heck is responsible for that. That's the reason why I'm here. I've tried other ways to get that answer. Oops, I'm done.
No, you have 30 seconds.
I would like for the city to determine who that is. I'd like to know who it is. I'd like to know why the bridge hasn't been repaired. And it seems like it's his responsibility. And that's not right. It's in our city. It's got to be the state, the city, the county, or CXX.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I also travel under that bridge every day. I know exactly what you're talking about. What was it, a year and a half ago where I wrote a letter to CSX?
Yes.
And CSX said it's the state responsibility, and then the state says the county. Didn't the state say the county maintains it? It's either way. They came and inspected the bridge and determined that it was structurally sound, but it needs a paint job, and that they if I remember correctly, they put it on their CIP to get it taken care of. We urged them to go quicker, and they said we're going to get to it when we get to it.
Mr. Mayor, who's the they in that situation?
It was
Is that
it the state or the county, Tony?
it
It's
was
been
the
a year and a half since that happened.
CSX inspected the bridge this year and provided the public version of the report, which is not the detailed report, and they concluded that that it confirmed that it is safe for rail traffic,
Right.
even though it doesn't look great. And they confirmed that they paint all their bridges eventually, but that there
But didn't
are no
they say that the
safety issues
state?
with the bridge.
Didn't they say that the state handles?
I believe the state. It was either the state or the county.
We'll have to go back to the correspondence. It's been a while, but we were on the same track.
Yeah, you had requested that.
I didn't mean, no pun intended. No pun intended.
I remember the original request from
If
middle of last year.
If you send me an email, I'll forward you the correspondence we got back on that, and you can see. Believe me, it's on our mind. Do we have any other speakers for public comments before we move on to our first joint public hearing?
Yeah, I just want to finish that response. So we've been working on it for a while on this, and we're still trying to figure out who's going to take care of it and when it's going to be scheduled to be.
Well, we actually have that info.
So I think we have that info, and we'll share it. That's what Judd is talking about sharing
Yeah.
with you.
We know when. We're not satisfied with when, but we know when. And I'll get it to you. Okay, we're going to move on to our First joint public hearing. If we can invite the planning commission up here to join us.
See you later.
And we have Laura Howell and Caroline Seiden to lead us.
Mr. Chairman. How are you? Great.
Take it away.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council and Planning Commission. This is a joint public hearing on text amendment CTAM 7709-2017. The draft text amendment proposes amendments to Chapter 24, Article 1, Section 24-1 entitled Definitions, Article 3 entitled Regulations Applicable to Particular Zones, Article 9 entitled Off-Street Parking and Loading, Section 24-219 entitled Parking Requirements Schedule, to establish new standards for care facilities. The hearing was duly advertised on September 14th and September 21st, 2017 in the Washington Post and posted on the city's website since September 11th, 2017. At the present time, there are 13 exhibits in the record files. They are referenced in an exhibit list in the files. The individual exhibits may be reviewed during the course of the meeting or in the Planning and Code Administration offices during regular business hours at City Hall or on the city's website. Any objections to the receipt of any exhibit should be noted prior to the closing of the record, otherwise they will be deemed received in evidence. And we are happy to present this text amendment to you this evening. And before we get into the details of it, I just wanted to go through some of the, a brief background on the genesis of the proposed text amendment and how it has evolved over time. Some of you may recall that the City Council received several requests from child care providers over the past several years for the city to re-examine its family daycare requirements. Some providers contended that the city's zoning ordinance was more restrictive for family daycare providers than that of Montgomery County, making child care in the city either more costly or in some cases unavailable. In response to these inquiries, the council directed staff to do some research on the issue. As a result of this research, staff presented a memorandum to the council in March of 2017, and that's Exhibit 11 in your package. The memo identified key differences between daycare requirements in the county and the city and suggested several options for how to address child care in residential settings. And in May of 2017, the council directed staff to begin work on a text amendment to the city's zoning ordinance to better align the city's daycare requirements with those of Montgomery County. This issue was also included as a Planning Division strategic action item in FY 2018. As we started the process, our initial goal was pretty simple: to expand opportunities for family daycare by bringing our ordinance more in line with the county's. This meant loosening zoning restrictions to permit more family daycare for up to 8 children by right, or for up to 12 children in some locations by special exception. But as we began to go section by section through the zoning ordinance, looking to expand family daycare specifically, we quickly discovered 2 key problems. First, our ordinance does not define family daycare, only child care centers. And second, many of the references to child care and child care centers were intertwined with references to elderly daycare, for which there was also no definition. So this led us to a re-examination of all of our definitions for all types of daycare facilities, and then we quickly recognized that this text amendment really required an overhaul of our definitions and zoning requirements for all types of care facilities, both day and residential. So the text amendment before you today seeks to provide clarity on the many types of care facilities, and it also removes some redundant or conflicting language among those uses. Broadly speaking, the proposed text amendment seeks to differentiate between child and adult daycare, between family and commercial daycare, and to modernize the language of our various care facilities to better reflect current practices and state and county licensing definitions. So one of the goals of the text amendment was to streamline the various definitions related to care facilities, eliminate the redundancy, and also ensure that all uses referenced in individual zoning districts are tied back to an actual definition in section 24.1. For example, there's references to nursing homes in the zoning ordinance, and it's listed as a permitted use in the MXD zone, but there's no definition for a nursing home. So this slide and the next slide, I tried to separate out the definitions that are being revised in this slide, and then some new definitions in the next slide. Some of the definitions that are being modified are as follows. The care home definition is proposed to be expanded so that it covers residential facilities for the care of many types of chronic and convalescent patients. It includes transitional housing, memory care, hospice, care for the handicapped, and other populations that were formerly included in the definition of group residential facility. And then we suggest to remove group residential facility from the definitions as it would be redundant. Second definition to be revised is dwelling, single family. It's proposed to be expanded to include townhouses and duplexes. This is really just a housekeeping item, as they are already included in that, but it's important in defining where family daycare is permitted. Next is elderly or handicapped persons. That's the current listing, and this definition is proposed to be separated into two definitions. One, persons elderly, and the other would be persons handicapped. Next, the hospital definition is being modified to remove some antiquated and potentially offensive language. Number 5, housing for elderly or handicapped. Again, in an effort to differentiate different groups and different uses, we are proposing to remove handicap from this definition, so it is just a definition of housing for persons 62 and above, and then housing for the handicapped individuals would be included in the care home definition. And finally, institutions, the definition would remove references to residential facilities. Basically, the residential institution is covered under the definition of care home. And then we are proposing 4 new definitions. Under the current code, as I said, there's only one definition for child daycare center. This definition does not differentiate between commercial and home-based childcare, which means that any restrictions on a daycare center's size or location or anything else are addressed in individual zoning districts and not addressed comprehensively. 3 of the new definitions help to differentiate between commercial adult daycare centers, commercial child daycare centers, and family daycare, which would cover people of any age requiring care in a family home situation. Each of these definitions also includes language tying them to state and county laws, rules, and regulations, so that if those change, our definitions don't need to be modified as well. And then again, the definition of persons handicapped has been separated from persons elderly that I mentioned in the previous slide. So once we established the set of definitions, we were able to go through each zoning district to establish which uses would be permitted in each zone, and also modify the terms used in each zone to reflect the new or modified definitions. I'm going to turn it over to Laura Howell now, who will be able to go through in more detailed fashion the proposed changes to each section of the zoning ordinance.
Good evening. As Caroline mentioned, I'll be going over more of the specifics of the proposed amendment. In the next several slides, you're going to see will all be set up the same way, with our current code requirements on the top half and then the proposed amendment on the bottom half of the slide. So for residential daycare, the city's zoning ordinance currently permits child or elderly daycare for up to 8 individuals in the zones you see listed on the top of the slide. But these daycare facilities are limited to single-family detached or duplex housing types only. In the proposed amendment, as Caroline just mentioned, we would change the terminology to family daycare, and we would allow providers to care for up to 8 individuals in all single-family dwellings, which would now include townhouses. This would be permitted by right in the zones you see listed towards the bottom, and then permitted by cross-reference in our floating zones, MXD, CBD, and CD zones. Currently, residential daycare facilities in the city can accommodate more than 8 individuals, but only as a special exception in the zones you see listed. The proposed amendment would permit family daycare for up to 12 individuals as a special exception in all single-family dwellings in the city, regardless of the zone. And I'd just like to point out that special exception uses require another level of review, and they can have additional restrictions placed on them. For multifamily housing, residential daycare is currently restricted to a special exception use in the zones you see listed at the top. We've revised the ordinance to permit family daycare for up to 8 individuals as a special exception only in all multifamily dwellings in the city. And I'd like to note that the R6 and the RA zones that you see listed under the current code are not listed under the proposed amendment, as these zones don't allow multifamily housing. So that was just some cleanup that staff needed to do. And before I move on, I just wanted to summarize all of our proposed family daycare changes. So in all single-family dwellings in the city, regardless of what zone they are located in, you would be able to have a family daycare facility for up to 8 individuals by right, or up to 12 as a special exception. And then in all multifamily dwelling units in the city, regardless of zone, you'd be able to have a daycare for up to 8 individuals only as a special exception. As you may remember from the sponsorship discussion, the current code has some additional restrictions on residential childcare. These are things that are already covered by state licensing requirements. So we've taken them out and then added language to the definitions for these uses, saying that they must all comply with any licensing regulations. This way we won't have to amend the ordinance whenever these licensing requirements change. And I'll discuss some of these requirements on a later slide. In regard to commercial or standalone daycare facilities, these are currently permitted in the zones you see listed at the top. And just like with residential daycare, they are also subject to additional restrictions. And again, these are covered already by licensing requirements. So we've taken that language out and just listed the use as a child and/or adult daycare center. These would be permitted by right in the zones you see listed at the bottom, by cross-reference in our floating zones, and then allowed by special exception in the zones you see at the very bottom. As I've been discussing some of the licensing requirements for these uses, this table just gives an overview of the organizations responsible for licensing the various types of care facilities. And just to give you an idea, some of the licensing requirements for child daycare include regulations on building safety and sanitation, staffing requirements, equipment requirements, and capacity limits. And then also each facility, both home-based and residential and commercial, must be inspected by the local fire authority. So moving on to care homes. As Caroline mentioned earlier, we've refined the definition for care home, and the ordinance uses a number of different terms to refer to these types of facilities, but none of these are actually defined anywhere in the ordinance. So we've taken out these references and replaced them with the term care home, since they are all now covered by the new care home definition. This use would be permitted by right in the 2 zones you see listed there, by cross-reference in our MXD zone, and then allowed by special exception in the zones you see listed at the very bottom. And then lastly, we've refined the definition of housing for the elderly or handicapped so that it is restricted to elderly and any ancillary uses such as skilled nursing facilities. Handicap housing would now fall under the care home definition, as Caroline discussed earlier. This use would be permitted by right in the zones you see listed by cross-reference in the MXD, CBD, and CD zones, and then by special exception in the RB and CB zones. So for our next steps, staff is recommending that the Planning Commission record remain open until 5 p.m. on October 25th for a recommendation on November 1st, and the council record to remain open until 5 p.m. on November 2nd for policy discussion on November 20th. And Caroline and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much for your work on this and the presentation. Who'd like to go first with questions or comments?
I have
Please.
A couple, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Thank you for your good work on this. I think when we were discussing the introduction, there was some initial discussion among the mayor and council about the impetus for this process. And you mentioned in your presentation that we had some child care providers who had come to the city and talked to us about, you know, the differentiation between the city and the county and how that makes it somewhat difficult to provide a much needed service these days. So let me ask you a couple of things. First, I noticed that exhibit number 11 is referenced in the index, and I wasn't able to find it in the materials that have been posted. That might have just been administrative oversight. But that's a memo to the mayor and city council from April 3rd,
Correct.
2017.
Right.
And I would just ask that staff go back and post it to the publicly available web
Okay, we'll
materials.
take a look at that.
If it's not already there, might just be me and I missed it somehow. But then the other thing I wanted to ask about was this definition of care home, sort of an umbrella definition of a number of different types of adult care facilities. Did staff put any consideration into whether there would be issues with lumping different types of adult care facilities that sort of do different things and operate in different ways into one zoning text amendment where, the same rules would apply to different facilities that may fall under this umbrella? For example, you could have very different types of facilities ranging from, hospice care to memory care to anything in between, and they all sort of seem to be put together. I'm just wondering if staff had any discussion about whether there were any issues or concerns with putting them all in one condition.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about even what to call it. Do you call it a care home? Do you call it a nursing facility? And we determined that, I think Laura did some research based on other jurisdictions and the state and how they approach some of these, that even if the care is for a different type of care, that they all would function within a community in the same fashion with residents and caregivers, regardless of what the type of care is.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
Okay. And then the other question I had was just to clarify for the public, when we use the term housing for the elderly, I mean, in the code, that would include things like senior housing developments that are age restricted
Yeah.
for active senior living as well.
Yeah, yes. It's by definition, it's 62 and over.
Okay.
Which doesn't sound so old.
Thank you.
I'm just curious about the notice. There's a list of addresses of people who were notified about this. And I'm not sure who, it's not like we're talking about a specific property and everybody within a certain radius. Who was selected to be notified about this?
So we sent notifications to all of our HOAs, and then we used our own internal database to find all care facilities that had received their fire inspections. So we sent notifications to those as well. And then we did a search for any additional care facilities we could find in the city, just to make sure we're covering all of our bases and notifying as many people as possible.
Okay, it was just, all that's listed here is addresses, so it's hard to tell who those were. That's a good answer, thank you.
Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Dodging
I
his
know.
head here. It's okay. Thank you for the presentation. Just to summarize, what we're doing here is we're trying to make it more consonant with the county's rules. Is that accurate?
That's how it started out, was that was an effort on the family daycare portion of it, was there were people coming that were able to get licenses from the state and then couldn't operate in Montgomery County, even if they could operate in, they couldn't operate in Gaithersburg, even if they could operate in Montgomery County because of our zoning restrictions. So that was the initial effort, was to make our family daycare mesh better with the county and with the licensing requirements of the state. But then, because of the complications of the way everything is written in the zone, it kind of morphed into some other areas where we really needed to separate everything out and then kind of rebuild it all so that we could look at each zone and use the same language in each zone and cover everything.
Okay. And so as we rebuild it to make it better, are we making it consonant or more like the counties, or is it still going to be disjointed between jurisdictions?
No, it is more like the counties. I mean, for instance, we never had anything in any of our zones that would permit up to 12 children in any family daycare situation. We didn't have that number. And we also didn't have as many locations where you could have it by right even for 8. There were places where it was listed for 8, but then with so many restrictions that you could kind of never really make it happen. So we've kind of opened it up so it matches the county a lot more than it did.
Okay. And as we increase the occupancy permits for the permissions for the various uses, do we have any concern about different sizes of houses? For example, a 1,000 square foot house might not be appropriate for the care of 12 people, whereas a 2,500 square foot house might be.
Right.
And if the use is by right.
Yeah, well, some of that.
Well, 12 wouldn't be by right.
12 would never be by right.
8 would be the by right, so that
Right.
might be the.
Right.
Right. And the
Plus,
state,
they still have to
like-
meet state requirements.
state-
Sorry,
right.
go
Right.
ahead. Go
So
ahead.
state
Okay.
licensing divides family daycare into 2 different sizes, and the small is up to 8, and the large group daycare is 9 to 12. So we are also following those guidelines as well.
Okay. And that was actually my last question was, page 70, we talked about removing the zoning restrictions because it was already covered by state licenses. Was there any preemption issues there where we lost the ability to control because the state was licensing on it, or are we giving up local control, even though because we think because the licensing?
No, well, we really don't have any control over the licensing. We're really only controlling the land use aspect of it to begin with. So I don't think that we've given that up.
But we're giving up the land use aspect of it because the licensing is in place. So and it doesn't mention what the restrictions are, but it looks to me like we're giving up the land use restrictions because there are state licensing regimes in place.
If I may
Yeah.
interject, I think I happen to be familiar. I encourage every parent in Gaithersburg to familiarize themselves with the state legislation that is in place in order to get a license for a daycare center as a mother, and what they have to go through. In Comert, and the licensing process is incredibly stringent. So I think that I encourage everyone to be familiar with that because it really does cover its bases.
Questions, comments?
I had a quick question. So since we started this process, have you noticed an increase of people who are interested in starting a childcare within their home?
The only interest we had was in, we had a couple phone calls from people that already operate these facilities, just asking in general more information about changes we were making, but we haven't had any more inquiries into opening up their own that we've been able to track or anything.
Thank you.
So, thank you for the presentation, and I think we're doing the right thing by clarifying it and matching what the county has provided. So, I guess what homeowners would want to know about a business that wants to establish themselves next door, what's the process? Some zones, it's by right, whatever the number is that's defined there by licensing, and some zones it's permitted by cross-reference, so MXD. Some zones it's permitted by special exception. So somebody comes in and wants to put in, they have a 2,500 square foot single-family home in a by-right neighborhood. What's the notification process to the neighbors about a facility like that? And suppose that, they want to allow up to 8 children or adults for a care home. What's the process? Does any?
Just to be clear, in most of those residential neighborhoods where it's a by right use, it is not a by right use as a standalone facility. It's an accessory use to the residential use. So you would be, the provider is required to be either the homeowner or the or someone that lives at the property.
Okay.
So we're not talking about having a single-family house that's suddenly turned into a daycare center.
Okay.
It's still primarily a residential home. If it's a by right use, they come in for a, they would have the fire inspection to make sure that it was properly set up for daycare. and they would be able to get a permit. There wouldn't be any notification to neighbors. If it's a special exception, then, which would be up to 12, adjacent property owners would be notified. It would be posted in the, on the city's website, and there would be a recommendation from the Planning Commission, and then a hearing at the Board of Appeals, so a two-step process. And the Board of Appeals would be able to put further restrictions on the site.
So that would include number of parking?
Number of parking, even
et cetera.
hours of operation, noise levels, even number, they could say no altogether. I mean, they're
Right.
not required to approve it if the conditions don't warrant it.
Okay. So in an area where there's special exceptions, then the neighbors would have an option to raise objection or concerns?
Yeah, and the property would also be posted. I didn't mention that. So
Okay.
there would be a sign on the property itself several weeks before the hearing.
And a by right facility?
Would
or
not have that.
Would not have that requirement?
Right.
Okay.
Danny?
I just had a quick question about the inspections. You talked about fire. Is that an annual inspection?
You know what, I don't know that. I know our our fire chief does the inspections, and I don't know what the requirements
Yeah, 'cause
are
I
by
didn't
the
see
county. I
anything.
would imagine as part of the state licensing that it would be, there are inspections required, but I don't.
And are there any like health inspections, like number of restrooms, water
Yeah, that's all
requirements, that
done by
kind of
the
thing?
state.
Okay, and you all, and that's kind of
That would be
grandfathered
part of
in,
their license
Oh, okay.
with the state of Maryland.
Yeah, so
And is that- go
before
ahead.
they could operate here, they would have to obtain their license from the state.
So there's some sort of health inspection as a part of that
Yes.
licensing? And and you don't know whether that's an annual process or anything like that? Or?
I'd have to look into
Yeah,
that and get back to you.
Okay. All right.
A couple of things.
Go ahead,
Real
John.
quick. The 2 over 2s that are in the city, do you consider those townhouses or multifamily or
Yeah, I think that's
duplexes?
considered multifamily.
Okay, so that would fall under the category. So what if something happens outside the house that's part of the operation? The only 2 examples I can think of are like play equipment, maybe a sign or something. What covers that? Does anything in the zoning cover that?
Well, in a residential zone, I know, other than a small plaque, like the kind of thing we would permit for a home-based business, I don't think that they would be able to have a sign.
With the
It's
sign, so
still
that
as-
would be the home-based business kind of criteria. What about like setbacks or amount of play equipment in the backyard or something like that?
It'd be the same as it would be for any residential facility. I don't think we have a setback per se for playground equipment, but it might fall under like an accessory structure, which would need to be either 3 or 10 feet from a property line, depending on the size and the zone. And
Just add that to the kind of look into it
Yeah.
category. I don't think it's a big deal, but just
Yeah.
I'm curious.
I'd be curious also
Yeah.
if
What's that?
the state licensing process looks into that as well in terms of, if you're going to have a playground in the backyard, does it have to meet certain criteria
Right.
if you're going to have a certain number of children in your facility?
Which is good too. If it's covered by that, that's okay too. I'm just
It-
curious where all that falls.
It does, Comer does cover that, and it does cover the health regulation, including the caregiver has to prove that they're healthy, and there's an incredibly lengthy process.
The ratio of caregiver to, person
Yeah.
being
That's all
provided,
done by
that's
the
all
state,
covered by
too.
state
Yeah.
licensing
There are
as well,
different,
so.
different ratios
Yes.
for different aged children, so I know under a certain age, the ratio is different. For infants, if they, children that can't walk out themselves in the case of an emergency, I know the ratio is much lower than it is for school-age children that can,
Yeah, it's 1 adult per 2
Right.
infants.
yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, then we will put this out to the public. This is a public hearing. We'd love to hear anybody who'd like to speak on this topic. Again, we ask that you keep your comments no more than 3 minutes. State your name and address or neighborhood for the record, and who would like to be our first speaker? Come on up.
Just Found it interesting. My name is Aaron Rosenzweig. I live in Wesley, founder of teamgaithersburg.org. Found it interesting that by right we can have 8 adults or 8 children, but by right we can only have 6 chickens.
6 what?
Chickens.
Thank you. Okay. Do we have any other speakers on this topic?
Could I ask another question following up on what Roselli said? So the individuals covered by the zoning, is that those being cared for, or is those being cared for plus the caregivers count as individuals?
So, it would be the number of people being cared for.
Okay, so the 8, it was infants, would be 8 infants and 4 caregivers according to the 1-to-2 ratio.
If they're infants.
Yeah.
If they're older than 2 years old, and then they can be old.
Okay, so
Right.
that would,
Right.
so that would be 8 individuals being cared for and then 4 people caring for those individuals.
If all of the people being cared for were infants.
Infants, yeah, and then
Right.
Yeah.
the ratio differs as you get
Yeah, and
older,
again,
cheaper as you.
I
know
don't,
that
I'm not
very
the
well.
expert about this, but a while back I looked into childcare, and that's why I decided to stay home with my children.
I hear you.
So I'm very familiar with it, but yes, I think all of that is covered, including the qualifications of the people who are taking care of the children.
And I beg to differ, you do seem to be the expert on this.
And any provider that had a school-age child, in other words, someone that was coming home from school in the middle of the day, that child would be counted towards the 8. That would not be in addition to the number of people that were already there if they were younger.
And so something that we experienced where I live, where we do have townhouses closer to each other, we do have a residential child care facility. And interestingly, under state law, the HOA's property has to be made available for playground use. So that you can put slides out into the common areas by right.
Mhm.
And so, as we put more density or consider putting more density of these into neighborhoods, there is that state law out there that would allow the occupancy of HOA areas for daycare uses.
And it's functioning that way now, I would assume, throughout the county, except in Gaithersburg and, and I guess around the state, right? I haven't heard it be an issue. It's an interesting thing to think about, but I haven't heard it be an issue of concern in other jurisdictions.
All right, so we have staff recommendations on the record. We'll go to the planning commission first.
Oh, we're done with hearing, okay, sorry.
Unless you have more questions.
No, thank you. So as was presented, staff is recommending the planning commission hold the record open until 5 p.m. Wednesday, October 25th, 2017. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second. So moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously. Mr. Mayor?
And our recommendation is to hold a record open until 5 p.m. Thursday, November 2nd, 31 days with anticipated policy discussion, November 20th.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, carries 5-0. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next we have another joint public hearing, consolidated, so this is going to be sort of a 2-topic public hearing.
Chickens don't live in the house.
Good evening, Mayor and Council, members of the Planning Commission. For the record, I am Lynn Board. Also with me this evening is Joe Van Eaton, who is outside counsel to the city, who's been assisting in this particular project. Tonight we have a consolidated joint public hearing on amendments to chapters 19, 20, and 24 of the Gaithersburg City Code related to the installation of wireless communications and distributed antenna systems in public rights-of-way and on private property. I do want to note that we do have a separate public hearing later this evening on small cell regulations. So if members of the public are here to speak on the regulations, if they would wait to that public hearing, although the 2 matters are related, and certainly the public is available to speak on the ordinances as well as the regulations, or both, if they choose to do so. I also do want to, just for the record, state that we are doing these as consolidated public hearings. The Planning Commission is here for Chapter 24, where the mayor and council are here to consider 19, 20, and 24, but they are all related, so the presentation is going to be on all of the ordinances, but when you all get to motions for the record for the Planning Commission, it would only be for the Chapter 4 changes, and the mayor and council would be for all 3 chapters. Sorry if this is a little confusing.
Everyone
but,
get all that? Because
but
this is
since
great.
the topics are all related, we decided to do it all together.
Yes.
But there will be obviously a little bit different motions when we get to that point of the evening. So by way of background, as you know, staff has been working for quite some time on this issue, and we are developing 3 different components to help address small cell and distributed antenna systems in the public right-of-way. And they deal with 3 documents. The first are the ordinances, which we're doing the public hearing on now. The second component are regulations, which are subject to a public hearing later this evening. And the third part is a standardized franchise and license agreements for use of the public rights-of-way, and that will be brought back before the mayor and council on December 4th. It is staff's recommendation that all of these items be brought back to the mayor and council for final policy action on December 18th. So you would have all 3 documents before you that evening for final policy consideration. So the reason that we brought this forward is the city had received several requests to place these types of facilities in the city's public right-of-way, and our current code provisions really don't address or provide regulations for facilities in the public right-of-way. Currently, Chapter 4 addresses them on private property, but really not in the public rights-of-way. So that's what brought the issue to the forefront. We held a work session on May 22nd, where we sought the mayor and council's guidance on all of these issues. Following that meeting, we did provide for a 30-day public comment period, so we could get some initial some initial public comments to get some direction as to how to move forward. We did receive a number of comments. Those are in the record this evening, and there are 6 exhibits in the record today. Based on those comments, staff, along with Mr. Van Eaton, did meet to review all of those comments. We made some revisions to both the ordinances as well as the regulations based on the comments we received at that time. Following that, on July 17th, chapters 19, the amendments to chapters 19 and 20 were introduced by the mayor and council, and the amendments to chapter 24 were sponsored by the mayor and council. Since that introduction, we have only received 1 additional public comment, and it is not in the record this evening, only because we received it Friday after the agenda packet was published. It was from T-Mobile, who are here this evening, but their public comments will be included in the record when it goes before the Planning Commission for further consideration and the mayor and council for final policy discussion. A notice of this joint public hearing was posted on September 11th, 2017. So now I'm going to move to the substantive parts of the ordinances itself. The first are the changes to Chapter 19, which is a section of the city code that deals with streets and sidewalks. We've added a number of definitions in Section 19-7. These include definitions of public improvement, easement, public facility, public utility easement, and underground areas. And the purpose of adding these definitions was really to provide some additional clarity and consistency between the various documents. And you'll see that these definitions have been carried through into proposed amendments to Chapter 24, as well as the regulations that will be before you this evening. So really the goal of these definition changes is to make sure that we have clarity and that also there's consistency between these various documents that I referred to. The more substantive change in Chapter 19 is to Chapter 19-9-A, and this relates to permits for construction in the public right-of-way or public improvement easements, and it clarifies that a permit is needed for these types of improvements. Something we've done by practice in the past, but it was never in the ordinance itself. We also added a new requirement in section 19A, 19-9A, which refers to regulations, and it does require all these facilities to be constructed in accordance with the regulations. And again, those will be before you a little bit later this evening. It also does require that any construction in the public rights-of-way be done in a way that at a minimum will require construction in a manner that minimizes risk to public safety, avoids placement of above-ground utilities in areas that only have below ground or underground utilities, and otherwise maintains the integrity and character of our neighborhoods. The final change to section 19-9A requires that a permittee obtain all required consents, licenses, or franchise with the city before they can construct improvements in the public rights-of-way. So turning next to chapter 20, this is the section of our city code that deals with the subdivision of land. The change here is pretty simple. It's to section 20-62, and it also adds a new requirement that any construction of facilities would meet the right-of-way standards. Again, that we'll be addressing a little bit later this evening. So again, for all of these sections, we are referencing and integrating the new proposed right-of-way regulations. And we turn to chapter 24, which the changes are a little bit more extensive in that section. And the intent of the changes here was for a couple of reasons. It was to establish requirements, criteria, and processes for the installations of these types of facilities in the public rights-of-way. They were updated to reflect current technology and applicable FCC, Federal Communication Standards and mandates. And it also adds a requirement to our current zoning to provide for installations of small cells, distributed antenna systems, monopoles, and towers on public and private property to reduce the impact in our neighborhoods and to protect public safety. So section 24-1 is the definition section of chapter 24. And we've added a number of definitions, and we've also amended a number of definitions in that section. And again, the purpose of these changes was to make sure that we had consistent definitions through chapters 19, 20, and 24, to be consistent with current federal law, always very important, to also be consistent with the anticipated new right-of-way regulations. And finally, to reflect the latest standards that are now applicable to the wireless technology industry. So the new definitions include definitions for public improvement easement, public property, public utility easements, reception antenna, rights-of-way, telecommunications facilities, new support structures, and utility poles. The amended definitions include the definitions for monopoles, telecommunications facility minor modification, telecommunications facility new, and telecommunications facility support structures, and then finally the definition of tower. We've also recommended deletion of the definition for telecommunication facility small cell, as we don't believe that this is kind of the latest and greatest term in the industry. So we're trying to update that to reflect current standards. So aside from the definitions, there are also a number of changes in section 24-167A, which is the section of the code that provides detailed regulations dealing with telecommunications facilities. And this section was updated to be consistent with all of the definitions that I just talked about. It also, in subsection B, clarifies that structures for the transmission of radio and television signals are permitted subject to the regulations in that particular section and certain height limitations. In subsection D, there are changes that ensures the installation in any public rights-of-way meets the requirements of both Chapter 19 and 20 and the new regulations. So again, we're trying to ensure consistency throughout these documents. It adds a new provision that would allow stealth installations on residential dwellings. Previously, there could be no installations on a private residence. but assuming that they meet certain standards, that would now be permitted. It allows private telecommunications facilities to be located in public rights-of-way, but there are caveats to that. They would obviously have to meet the right-of-way regulations. They would also have to be granted a license or franchise and pay required fees. There's also a provision that would allow the mayor and council to either hold a public meeting or hold a public hearing prior to installation. Previously, the code allowed towers and monopoles to maintain at least 3 carriers, and we still have that requirement. However, we have provided a exception that they could have less than 3 if they are provided in stealth facilities. And again, the stealth facilities are intended to be designed in such a way that it minimizes the impact, the visual impact of those facilities. In subsection E of section 24167A, it does allow for staff approval of telecommunication facilities if it meets all the requirements of the section and the regulations. So this would be done as a staff approval as opposed to coming to the mayor and council or some kind of conditional use permit as these go forward. However, they would have to meet all of the requirements. There's a new sections 18 and 19 of subsection E that provides that the city may permit installation of telecommunication facility if an applicant submits proof that it would be effectively prohibited from providing personal wireless service. The reason this provision is in here is basically because it's required under federal law. We can't categorically prohibit these, so it does allow a provision if there are exceptional circumstances that may be provided. There are some caveats to that. They would not be permitted on historic structures or within a historic district where any portion would be visible from the ground. And it also exempts facilities that are less than 1 cubic feet in size if they are strand mounted. So if it's up on the wire and it's less than 1 cubic feet, they would be permitted. There's also a requirement that residents 500 feet away from the facility at the time of application would receive notification. And finally, there's a requirement for any applicant to receive an approval that they would have to be licensed by the Maryland Public Service Commission as a public service company. I would like to thank staff, Dennis and Frank, have helped and put a lot of work in this, as well as Mr. Van Eaton. For the amendment to Chapter 24, staff is recommending that the Planning Commission hold their record open until 5 p.m. on Friday, November 3rd, with the anticipated recommendation on November 15th. And for Chapters 19, 20, and 24 for the Mayor and Council, we're recommending that the record be kept open until 5 p.m. on Wednesday, November 22nd, with anticipated policy discussion on December 18th. And with that, Joe and I are available to answer any questions that you may have.
Lynn, thank you very much. Thanks to staff, thanks to Joe for all the work that you put in. I feel like we've taken a while to get through this and set sort of our priority and policy goals here, and you guys have done an incredibly admirable job wading through extremely dense waters here. In fact, I think aside from policy discussion on December 18th, we should all be awarded law degrees because this has got to be the densest issue that we've dealt with in the last decade. Questions, comments? Yes.
Yeah, and thank you for that comment, because I want to make sure that I'm clear on this. Now, if an individual, like certain people, have issues with cell reception in their homes, and they want to put some sort of, auxiliary, antenna or something, do they have to get a permit? I mean, I wasn't really clear. I think you addressed it to an extent, but I just didn't get it maybe.
Yeah, currently people are allowed to install antennas and other facilities in their properties. that would serve their home
Personal
individually.
use, yeah.
And we're not changing those regulations in any way.
Okay, but what if that, even if it's external, if they have an external
I mean,
antenna?
they would have to go through the existing process for
Okay,
that.
okay, all right, thank you.
I'll ask a question if it's all right.
Please.
Then I apologize if I'm wading outside of
No,
chapter 24 and into some of the chapter, but if design guidelines or some kind of placement guidelines or something that helps to drive the appearance of these facilities throughout, is that something we can author and implement? Is that part of what could happen, or does it already exist in sort of some form? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we are, and again, the regulations will be discussed in a little bit later this evening, but one of the things that we have solicited from the industry is some kind of prototype of what they're proposing so that the city can review those. And our goal with that is to approve a couple prototypes that we feel are appropriate.
Okay.
You know, obviously they would somewhat be dependent on where if they're located in residential areas versus commercial areas. Again, when we get into the regulations, we'll get much more into that. But the idea is to have, you know, several prototypes that, you know, are kind of pre-approved so that, you know, certainly for the industry that they know what we're looking for.
Okay. And then, you know, when we've had to do the Planning Commission has done recommendations to the Board of Appeals on cell towers and other sort of larger pieces of infrastructure. And one of the things that keeps coming up is a provision that if they move out or the service is discontinued or whatever, they have to remove the stuff, whatever that might be. Is there something about that in the regulation too? So given that this may end up being at staff approval, and there may be a lot of them over the course of some number of years.
That would really appear in two different locations. There are provisions for that in the regulations, but also for the industry folks, they will be entering into a franchise license agreement with the city, and that would be a provision of that agreement.
That would be
as
there.
well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Thank you for the presentation. Just a question on the private property uses, that's kind of a new subject. Where does the 179 feet come from? Do you think it's an adequate setback? And why are we considering allowing?
I'm sorry, we're a little confused. Where did you find the 179 feet?
Sorry, it's in chapter 24.
D2
Okay.
of 24-167A, section D2.
I'll have to find it again.
I think it's an even number if you're counting in qubits.
High holidays.
Oh, no.
Pages 89 to 90.
I'm just trying to fill up the silence here.
Pages 89 to 90 in the
Oh,
packet.
you're talking about the 1 foot of setback for every 1 foot of height
Yeah.
with a 179-foot limit.
Okay.
Yeah, so those first two questions, and then walk me through why we're allowing a by right use for stealth as opposed to a special exception for non-stealth towers. What's the logic there?
Sure. Well, the idea in all these regulations is to create safe harbors where if someone builds a less intrusive facility, and it's easier to get approval than if they build a facility that's going to be more intrusive. And the stealth facility is almost by definition less intrusive for two reasons. One is because you can approve the design to make sure it fits into the neighborhood and the character, you know, that the tree looks like a tree, that, or if that's what it is,
It don't
or
look
it's
like a
attached
tree.
to it. Or more commonly, if it's put on the side of a building that it looks like a cornice or something like that that fits into the architectural design of the building. Whereas a facility that's not stealth is by definition going to be visible, and it's going to be subject to automatic expansion under federal law, section 6409. So it makes it more important to review it closely the first time around.
Okay, so that's a good reason for it. But my concern is in differentiating between the two. Why wouldn't we just put it all by special exception? I realize it may be a little more onerous process, but it allows the use but it allows a regime for making sure that whatever it is appropriate for the property, as opposed to allowing it to be as a by right use.
Yeah, staff did look at a special exception use. Part of our concern there is, you know, there are federally imposed shot clocks from the time that the city has to, once we get an application, to the time we have to approve the application. Going through a Board of Appeals special exception process may be very difficult to meet those shot clock time restrictions. Is one of the concerns we had. The other is, you know, really if we develop, and that's the purpose of the regulations, is to, you know, develop very specific requirements. We didn't know that, you know, you gain a lot through the Board of Appeals process if it's, you know, very tightly regulated, and, you know, we kind of decide upfront of what we want and what's acceptable.
Okay. My only comment there would be, for initial install, it's 6 months, and then a court order after that. It's not like we lose our rights under the co-location. But, okay, I'll look at when we get to the regulations, we'll talk about how specific they are and how controlling they are. Thanks.
Go ahead, Phil.
I guess my question is on the stealth, and maybe some of this is covered in the regulations later, but what level of design review is provided for the stealth? And I'm assuming stealth is a sort of by right, whether it's public right of way or private. What I'm getting at, my concern is, we've seen a number of quote unquote stealth installations come before the Planning Commission that were anything but, and had pretty substantial architectural impacts. And so I just want to understand what level of review there is, and who determines what stealth is stealthy enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a large part that's going to be determined under the regulations. You know, and I do also want to indicate, I mean, one of the issues here is particularly in the public rights of way. I mean, the city is the owner of those properties, so it is a proprietary function, so we do have a fair amount of control over what we allow or we don't allow on our proprietary property, similarly to requests we've had in the past for towers and that type of thing that are on city property.
Mr. Mayor, thanks. I had a question about the sections dealing with the small facilities that are less than 1 cubic foot. And they make reference to the potential involvement of hazardous materials or the involvement of excavation in association with that size facility. Where do we define what's considered a hazardous material? Do we make reference to some other definition, or are we incorporating standards from federal or state law?
We have not defined that specifically in the ordinance. I mean, that's something that we can look to add.
Okay. I'm just wondering if that becomes an issue, how do we decide what material is hazardous or not? Given that, you know, this is equipment that's going to contain all different kinds of components. The second part of that question was, when we talk about involving excavation, what do we mean? I mean, if we have to trench to a pole that's already an existing pole in order to put, you know, cable in to connect a facility that's less than 1 cubic foot, is that considered excavation? I don't know. If it is, I'm just kind of curious how that applies, and, you know, that would immediately trigger some review beyond a staff review?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
We intended to be very broad. If you have to dig, that has a different impact than if you're just putting it on an existing strand that doesn't require a replacement of a pole. That's a sort of, you actually are seeing those devices around town already.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is you could have a situation where it doesn't require placement of a pole, but it does still require digging. There may be an existing pole, but you might still have some digging.
Yeah,
Right.
and that, any kind of digging takes it out of the, it takes it out of the idea that that's an unintrusive category you don't really need to look at, as long as it meets public safety requirements. But once you add an excavation, then you're in a different ballpark.
So there would be something beyond merely staff review in any situation like the one I described?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments before we go to the public?
Just one quick question, and just has to do with waiving the dimensional restrictions of an antenna that the Board of Appeals may consider, provided the board makes the additional finding that the increased size is integrated into the structure and limits the visual impact to the maximum extent possible. So what's maximum extent possible? And what is integration into the structure and visual impact? Are we defining those to some extent so that we know what an exception is actually might look like?
Yeah, I mean, the Board of Appeals currently does hear a number of these telecommunication requests. It's something that is fairly regularly on their agenda for consideration. They generally have fairly broad powers when they're issuing special exceptions, so it would allow them to place conditions. We also generally use a little bit more broad terms for the Board of Appeals so that they do have some discretionary authority to look at, the community, the impact on the community, those types of factors involved there. So, I mean, we've intentionally kind of left that language a little bit broader to give the Board of Appeals authority to look at those issues.
Okay. Nice work on this.
All right, this is the time when the Mayor and Council and Planning Commission like to hear from anybody who wants to speak on these public hearing topics. Again, right now we're talking about the ordinances. We will go on to another public hearing on regulations. So if anybody would like to speak, we ask that you keep your comments to no more than 3 minutes. State your name and address or neighborhood for the record. Who'd like to be our first speaker? Come on up, please.
So do you get 6 minutes in total, Mr. Mayor, if you testify on both?
Yeah.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. My name is Joshua Turner. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C. with the firm of Wiley Ryan. I'm here on behalf of Crown Castle this evening. And I think most of my comments are going to be with respect to the regulations, so I'll get up and do those later at the appropriate time. Did want to commend the city for taking this issue seriously. It is an important one. Obviously, my client is very interested in investing in the city as soon as possible. We are one of the people who came to the city with our applications in hand and are basically ready to go as soon as the city is ready to have us come in and help improve wireless service in Gaithersburg. With respect to the regulations, I think, as I said, I think our main issues remain with the regulations. With respect to the ordinances themselves, one big concern that we have, and we've heard this consistently, is this idea that we should minimize or quote-unquote avoid placement of wireless facilities in areas where all of the other facilities are undergrounded. We appreciate that, and we appreciate that lack of clutter is important. At the same time, basic physics dictates that wireless service cannot be provided from underground. And so to the extent that you're going to offer wireless service, to the extent that you're going to place wireless facilities, those facilities need to be above ground. And any local regulation that discourages placement of wireless facilities in areas that otherwise need wireless facilities, I think that's a big concern to us. I think, the other thing that I heard Attorney Board say with respect to ownership of the rights of way that I would just caution you about, this question of whether or not the city actually owns the rights of way and acts in a proprietary capacity is not actually a settled question of law. There's a fair argument that that is not a proprietary action by the city and that you're subject to the same kinds of federal restrictions on access to the rights of way as you would be with respect to anything else. So I just throw that out there. And then the last thing I want to say is there is, as you have all recognized, a lot of law in this area. There's a lot of density of law in this area. And the federal government is actually acting as we speak. The FCC has a number of proceedings that will deal with small cells and access to the rights of way. My concern is, given the detail with which the city has approached this issue, and we talked about updating the regulations and making sure that they reflect the latest technology. Technology evolves so quickly that we're afraid that if there is a detailed suite of regulations, those regulations will be obsolete the moment that they're enacted. And that anything that the FCC does, and it may act even later this year, might further obsolete the regulations that the city has worked so hard to put together. So our message is less is more with respect to regulation of wireless facilities, and being too detailed in the way in which you approach this topic might set you up for having to do this all again next year, which I don't think anyone wants. And I'll be back up on the regulations.
Thank you. Well, Aaron comes up here. I just want to also state to everyone that if you have additional testimony that goes beyond the 3 minutes, you're welcome to submit it in writing, and we'll consider it just like we consider oral testimony.
My name is Aaron Rosenzweig. I'm from Wesley and teamgaithersburg.org. This gentleman was talking about simple physics and talking about not being able to write laws and ordinances and regulations that prohibit. Well, here's something to think about. Every pole that we build in residential areas should be designed to break away. It's true almost all over the country. It's true here. It's true in the county. If we build a light pole, we build any pole, it should be designed to break away. But simple physics tells us that if we put a refrigerator-sized cabinet for 3 different carriers on the side of a pole, and we put a 300-pound antenna at the top of the pole, that wind will just knock down that pole if it's designed to break away. So all of these poles that they want to put in residential areas are going to be hardened poles. Poles that when our children lose control of their vehicle and hit the pole, it will kill the driver instead of knocking down the pole. There is no judge in the land that would have a question about regulations that say that poles put in residential areas should all be designed to break away. If we put that in our regulations, that's something defensible. We're not talking about health hazards from radiation. We're not talking about, all we're saying is that if the technology is not ready to give us poles that are safe, then the technology is simply not ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other speakers on the ordinances? Please, come on up.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, members of the Planning Commission. My name is M.G. Diamond with law offices in Bethesda, Maryland, as well as in the Kentlands in Gaithersburg. I represent Selco Partnership, doing business as Verizon Wireless. Specifically with regard to Chapter 24 of the ordinance, and most of my comments this evening go to the regulations. I'll be back. But with regard to Chapter 24, I think you've got a problem in the ordinance that it makes you inconsistent with most other jurisdictions with regard to the construction of new poles or new towers on private property. The way the ordinance is worded now, a carrier coming in would have to come in and have 2 additional carriers from the start to attach to the structure. Almost every other jurisdiction that I do business in requires that when proposing the building of a new macro tower or pole, that the carrier build it to such strength that it's capable of holding 3 carriers. But if Verizon Wireless is coming in to build a new structure, it can't necessarily line up the timing of 2 other carriers. They may be 5 or 10 years away from having an interest in that pole. So it's a minor piece of wording. I know at least one of the other carriers submitted in writing on the issue. The phrasing should be capable of supporting 3 rather than requiring at the outset that all 3 carriers attach to the structure. And the rest of my comments to the regulations.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any other speakers on the ordinance part? Please, come on up.
My name is Bob Mitchell. I live on Turnham Court, and I've lived there since 1975. This business of the neighborhood having the character that large poles and other things are not to be put into it, and then someone saying that if they're going to put a pole in it, they can't honor that. The question is, they're presuming that they have to put a pole there. Now, this is obviously an important issue, and the character of the neighborhood and of the city is important to you and important to us. I'm making one suggestion here. And that suggestion is a very practical one, and that is that as you do more homework on this issue, I would like for you to explore some parallels. When I first moved here, our homeowners association had a rule that said no one could have one of these 12-foot diameter radar type things that you get television signals from satellites. Now, a lot of people didn't like that, but the homeowners association said that the character of the neighborhood was that we would not have these 12-foot diameter antennas. That seemed to be a reasonable thing for them to do. There might be other parallels. I would think that someone could say the character of the neighborhood is that we will not have 40-foot trucks parked on the street in front of someone's house. And someone could say, if we're going to park our trucks in front of the house, we can't have that rule. Well, that might be a reasonable thing for us to do. We also, when I moved here, had rules about swimming pools. And the homeowners association said we will not have above-ground pools because that is not consistent with the character of our neighborhood. Now, a pool supplier could say, if we're going to put in pools in your neighborhood, then we can't have a rule that certain kinds of pools are inconsistent with the character of the neighborhood. So I would think as a very practical matter that some exploration into other things that are similar could be done. And I suspect that there are a lot of similar things that people would like to do that they can't do. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other speakers on this topic? Come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members, and city. My name is Vasilios McGinnis from the Wesley Development, and thank you, neighbor, for all these good comments and simplicity of analogy that you brought up. Thank you. I would like to thank the city, all the council members, all the staff for the outstanding work that they have done to this date, handling a situation and an issue way bigger than many jurisdictions, including the federal government, cannot handle well. I'll go straight on the ordinances, and I'll say on Chapter 19, Section 19, 9A, Paragraph C, the section is good and should be more reinforced, especially in areas which have below-ground utilities. To come, it's unthinkable to park this 50-foot truck and the above-ground pool in the front yard of the people. You cannot do that of the people's property. People have paid for these properties, they maintain these properties, and they don't want their values to go out just for someone, a private company, to make money. It's a good section and should be reinforced even more than that. Chapter 20, there is a private, the chapter refers to a private property. It's not quietly defined there. You may want to look into that and reinforce that one as well. Chapter 24, page 4, telecommunication facility support structure. References many things, including light poles. Light poles that you have for security lights in the right-of-way, to come now and stick an antenna on the top. I think that defeats the purpose, is beyond inventive and intrusive to the neighborhood, and defeats why this light pole is there in the first place. I think you may want to define what's a light pole, what type is the light pole, what height is the light pole, and if it's under 15 feet, sorry, no installations allowed. Page 12, last one, says that telecommunication facilities to be away 300 feet from historic structures, and for residential structures defines as 1 foot per foot of height. I think it should be made at least equal, 300 feet away. That's all that I have to say for ordinances. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers on this topic? Okay, not seeing any. Did Did you have something more, John?
No, I was.
Okay. All right, so we have recommendations. Now, Lynn, this was a consolidated, so we have to do, the planning commission only needs to do one motion here.
Correct.
All right, you guys go ahead.
Okay. So in our involvement in making a recommendation on the amendments to Chapter 24 only, the staff recommends that the Planning Commission hold their record open until 5 p.m. Friday, November 3rd, 2017, with anticipated recommendation November 15th, 2017. Is there a motion, please?
So moved.
Second. Moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It passes unanimously, and we'll leave the other sections to you all.
Okay. Now, Lynn, do you need one from us or two?
Yes, since this is a consolidated public hearing, you can make one motion for all three of the ordinances.
Okay.
When they come for final action, you have to do each separately, but.
Okay, so staff recommends that we hold our record open until 5 p.m. Wednesday, November 22nd, 51 days. Anticipated policy discussion December 18th. What's the pleasure of the council?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, carries 5-0. That gets us through that part, and Planning Commission, you're welcome to stay. On December 18th, you guys can get law degrees too, if you hang out. But not seeing that, okay. Thank you all for being here. Okay, now, Joe is gonna stay, and we're bringing up Dennis, our deputy city manager, and Frank, our assistant city attorney, for the next public hearing on the regulations.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. As Lynn had introduced, we are going to cover the regulations for installations in the public right-of-way. I will note that these only apply to the public right-of-way. There would be additional items covered under Chapter 24, which deal with private property, a little bit differently than what we're going to discuss here tonight under our sections. Just to give you a little bit of background with this proposal, it's noted here that the regulations were introduced as part of a public hearing process on August 21st. I will note that that public hearing was posted on August 23rd, 2017. We've been actually dealing with this since, at least at the council level, since April 2016. We've had 4 work sessions related to these regulations in various forms that you have seen in the past, so I wanted to give you that kind of brief, comprehensive overview rather than going through each of the specific dates. Again, this was created as a response to some applications we were receiving, and we wanted to make a holistic approach to telecommunications within the public rights-of-way. We also took this opportunity to look at some of the changes that the FCC has implemented. As noted by one of the speakers, it's likely that additional FCC regulations will come out, and we will need to revise the regulations accordingly. I also wanted to point out that we're a little bit different than other jurisdictions within Montgomery County and other places, that we do not have any current standards or regulations in place, and there are no zoning requirements that apply to the right-of-way. There are jurisdictions such as Montgomery County that apply zoning regulations to the right-of-way. We do not under our current code provisions. I'm going to kind of cover the 4 areas that the regulations cover, and then Frank's going to go into a little bit more detailed about the overall regulations, and then I'll kind of summarize the small cell portions related to those regulations. The first section applies to all facilities or all installations in the right-of-way. I know tonight we're focusing a lot on the small cell facilities, but there are other facilities that locate within our right-of-way, such as your Time Warner, your AT&T. All of those also have facilities within the right-of-way, and these regulations would apply to that. Section 2 is really kind of additional regulations dealing specifically with some of the other utilities like WSSC, PEPCO, and those entities. The third section
is really specifically oriented towards wireless facilities and carriers in those categories. And then the fourth section is actually standards for wireless facilities on our own city-owned streetlights and city-owned poles. In terms of drafting the regulations, and I will note, we will not go through them page by page because they're 85 pages, and I don't think anybody wants to be here that long, nor does anybody on television want to hear us go through that. We did look at a number of municipal codes nationwide. We also focused on New York City, primarily because all the current providers have signed agreements with New York City. I understand they're a little bit different than we are in terms of size and density levels, but we felt there were a number of items that we could take from that. In addition, we did look at Montgomery County, which is currently under the same process we are in terms of developing their regulations. In fact, they have a public hearing coming up, or at least a notification of that public hearing. We also initially looked at input from the industry. We didn't get as much as we had hoped. Hopefully tonight we'll get a little bit more in terms of getting feedback of what facilities would work for them, and we also took input from the public. In addition, I wanted to thank everyone on staff. To review an 85-page document over a period of time is hard enough, but in some cases we had a week or a week and a half to review it to meet the deadlines for publication on those items. So all the staff who participated in that, I wanted to thank that. And with that, I'll actually turn it over to Frank. Or I have one more slide, sorry about that. I wanted to give a little bit of coverage on the federal regulations. We do this every time we present this because we do have provisions that are restricting what applications we can do under the FCC regulations. We cannot do regulations that would effectively prohibit wireless service facilities. We do have to be open-ended in terms of trying to provide those facilities within our community. We cannot discriminate between various providers. There are some shot clocks or reasonable period time ranges for different types of facilities, and the regulations take that into account, both the ones presented earlier this evening and also the ones we are covering right now. Those range from 60 days to 150 days under the current FCC regulations in terms of approval. Any denials of applications must be in writing with substantial evidence to support that denial. And then again, the big one we always talk about is that the local regulations cannot consider environmental effects of radio frequency emissions.
Okay, well, I will say that at some points the regulation size was a bit more than even 85 pages. So, so what you're looking at is a consolidated version. Are you? I can't tell whether I'm on and you all can hear me or not. You can't?
Yeah.
Okay. I can't tell, so that probably means it's working pretty well. In terms of the first section, these are rules that apply overall. They specify basic purposes, identify the city's primary role, basically as the chief steward of the public rights of way, identifies there's a need for a permit and city approval before anything proceeds, and identified certain key elements of safety and requirements for specific plans and drawings. There are a number of chapters to this introductory chapter, which again covers all, is intended to cover all installations. What it applies to, certainly very broad, but seeks to avoid conflicts with state law, franchise agreements, and public utility easements. Again, bearing in mind, this isn't just focused on one category, this is focused on anything in the rights of way. Fairly long list of definitions, minimum requirements for all applications, and lays out numerous requirements for all installations that the city and public use is certainly primary. The right-of-way has to remain passable, and any damage has to be repaired and restored. Again, we're not only thinking of all installations, but the whole, and you'll see some of the indications of this, the whole lifespan of the installations as well. Repairs are occasionally needed. Sometimes something's no longer used. What happens then? Sometimes there's damage and then it has to be repaired. So just to keep that in mind. So coverage also reaches, again, broadly, excavations, repair and restoration, permit inspections, and then, of course, insurance, liability, indemnity, and insurance requirements. And I'd mentioned future maintenance, rules for future relocation and removal of installed facilities, the city's authority for future and ongoing inspection, and certainly the removal of graffiti on any equipment. We saw a number of other rules and regs that deal with that because that is another reality. Now, the second section are additional regulations for, essentially for non-wireless installations. So everything beyond that, and these are in some ways extensive as well, applies to all work in the rights of way, specifies permit application and appeal processes, minimal intrusiveness on the neighborhoods. Again, not even for wireless, but we still want to protect the character of the neighborhoods. Allow city removal of an installation that was installed without a permit, a stop work order, and revocation for breach of regulations, applicable standards, or the permit. What are some of the requirements? Certainly lays out overall construction, reconstruction, repair, and maintenance requirements. And I will say some of the involvement of the public works staff and looking at the Montgomery County regs and many of the other standards that were involved are very helpful in putting this together. Requires compliance with the current version of any applicable standards, and that's intended to be a term of art, including Montgomery County DOT standards that are, as are noted here, and also state highway standards. Generally requires exterior attachments to poles to be 8 feet above grade and not above sidewalks. I'd mentioned some of the standards. These are those that apply. Requires seeding and soil stabilization. Again, I said this was broad. It is indeed. For excavations outside the roadway. Specific street and roadwork requirements, such as steel plates and traffic management, for work that sometimes will be in the roadway. And then, of course, when you're dealing with this, these are the standards that have to be included. So grading, storm drainage, curb and gutter, and that the list there. Again, not wireless, but when you're dealing with an overall regulation covering all installations, that's what you have to do. Now, the third section does deal with wireless facilities requirements. That also lays out a permit application, certain standards for staff approval, again, following federal law, partly the federal timelines that need to be honored. Proposed installation must address an identified gap in service or lack of service. Some safety hazard protections certainly are in place. Installation requirements on investor-owned existing utility poles. Certainly requires Historic District Commission approval if it's in the Historic District. Prohibits work in environmentally sensitive areas without approval or showing that denial would result in an effective prohibition of service. And that's something that we've had to be very careful to include under federal rules. Only one base station per pole unless all cumulatively do meet the overall requirements, that is, for aesthetics, appearance, and safety. Some specific standards: base station equipment must be aesthetically consistent with the pole and nearby area. I mean, there are more specific certainly in the regulations. The antenna and equipment housing requirements and specific size limits, again, are some of those laid out very specifically in quite a bit of detail. Wiring or cabling has to be inside the pole or flush. An electric meter installed should be installed inside the pole unless that is not possible. And there are instances where that may be the case. And then we certainly want the smallest possible. And specific visual appearance requirements, including non-reflective matching paint. And there are some specifics even as to the paint. And that's following some of the rules that are already out there. Those were not things that we made up. In terms of specifications, base stations have to be at least 500 feet apart, have to demonstrate compliance with the RF exposure limits from the FCC. Periodic future testing and reporting requirements to ensure that compliance, and no permit approved where there's no further space for more facilities or safety is endangered. And then for the installation on city-owned equipment, that's the fourth section. That means we're coming close to the end for those who are listening. The city is, again, as Dennis mentioned initially, acting in its proprietary capacity where the city has the most discretion. And the regulations do specify these are the minimum requirements, but certainly more could be applied. This addresses use of city-owned structures and requires a prior agreement. The city may vary specific requirements, as I noted. Does not guarantee a lease of any or all street lights or traffic signal poles. The city will only allow, as far as basic requirements, entities who will operate the base station themselves. The right to establish license and/or rental fees, certainly specified. Specifying that wireless use will be secondary to the city's public use. That's, in other words, using a traffic signal or a pole that the city needs. The city's needs come first. The facility has to be moved if the city so directs for whatever reason. The city will not be responsible for maintenance, and all work, including repair work, requires city approval, which is very consistent with the other lines that we have dealt with as to other utilities and wireless overall, that city approval is going to be required.
And with that, I'll kind of cover some of the other regulations related to private-owned utility poles and city-owned utility poles such as street lights or traffic signals. Again, the base stations must be equipped and designed to aesthetically consistent with the pole and the nearby area. There are specific antenna and equipment size requirements under the guidelines, and those are spelled out within the regulations. Wiring or cabling must be flush or pole mounted. Electrical meter should be installed inside the pole unless required by the utility company. Currently, Pepco requires them to be on the outside of the pole, but we wanted to write the regulation to allow that flexibility. And then specific visual appearance requirements, including non-reflective or matching paint. Just to give everyone an idea of those locations, I wanted to remind everyone what they were, those areas were. Again, where we have existing private utility poles, such as owned by Pepco, there are a few Verizon. It's in this area shown on the map, which is really kind of the eastern part of Gaithersburg, or the Old Town sections of Gaithersburg. There are a few outlining areas. As you can see, these highlighted lines up here, which is Ridgeview Road, and then Dash Drive down in this section here, and then there's a small section of Crown Farm. Then there's also this, as Frank pointed out, the sections where we have city streetlights and traffic signals. Again, the city retains ownership of those specific facilities. And for example, we own all the streetlights. Pepco owns the underlying cabling below, but we own the streetlights. The traffic light signals, we actually own those, and they're maintained by the county. Again, some of the same restrictions apply, that the base stations must be at least 500 feet apart. No permit approved if there's no further space or allocations for more facilities, or that safety is endangered. So we are looking at it from the standpoint of safety, because they're adjacent to public roadways, which brings up issues of both vehicular and pedestrian traffic placement. Replacement of streetlights would only occur if necessary, and we'd only restrict those to allow a 5-foot extension of that pole. Most of our street lights, the ones that light up the street, not the traffic signals, are somewhere between 12 and 15 feet. So you'd be looking at approximately 20 feet with the 5-foot extension. Most of the traffic signals are actually larger than that, so they would range in the 25-foot to 30-foot aspect. Those would be extended 5 feet above that. And again, I'll show you some of the locations for those facilities. I can get my thing to work. So these are the locations for our existing traffic signals. We don't own a lot of traffic signals within Gaithersburg. Again, most of our right-of-way does not include some of the larger arterials, such as 355, 124, 117. Those would be controlled by the county regulations. Now I can't get out. The other item that I would point out in terms of what we're looking at for the regulations is we are classifying those areas where streetlights and streetlights could be allowed would be those areas that are either considered collector or minor arterials. Those are shown on this chart here, kind of in the bolder sections, the purple and the blues and some yellows. Those would be areas that we would allow for pole replacement or actually co-location on existing facilities. We are not currently proposing at this time to allow those facilities that are owned by the city in residential neighborhoods. One of the issues too that we know will occur is that we will have a number of providers or real estate companies who are interested in forming leases for those facilities within our community. So the city's looked at ways that we can kind of allocate those fairly between all the different providers that would like those. So there are a number of provisions in the regulations that talk about pole reservation. This would allow different companies to reserve poles within our community. And then I will note that the regulations allow us to opt for the most favorable proposal on those where two different providers or users wanted to use that pole. And you've already heard about the ordinance changes related to 19, 20, and 24. Those were discussed tonight in terms of the public hearing aspect. We will be bringing forward to you in a future meeting date. Staff is still refining the right of entry and the franchise agreements, which would be standardized for those small cell facilities. And with that, I can talk about when we plan to do the recommendations for keeping the record open. We recommend that the record be open until 5 p.m. on October 31st. This is a little bit shorter time period than the other regulations, partly because we were anticipating a lot of public comment and needed some additional time to get those ready and combine those comments into a final document that we would prepare to present to the council on December 18th.
Thank you, Dennis. Did you have any more?
I did not have anything else,
All right.
unless you have questions for us.
No. Well, I'm sure we will, but I appreciate the detailed presentation. Who wants to go first? Ryan.
I've got a few questions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, one of the speakers during the earlier hearing talked about the concern that technology or federal regulation may move more quickly than the city's efforts. And just wondering if staff could talk a little bit about that and sort of the reason why we separated out regulations from ordinances, and the fact that the council is able to amend regulations by resolution rather nimbly and quickly without some of the longer procedural processes that come with ordinances, and how you see that playing out in the event that there are changes in federal law or changes in technology.
Typically on regulations, we would not hold we don't typically hold public hearings. That is an option of the council. In this particular case, you chose to hold that public hearing as part of the process for these regulations. Should we decide to move forward with additional changes, you would again be offered the opportunity to decide whether you wanted a public hearing. Again, typically we do not do public hearings on regulations. We do public meetings where they're presented at a council meeting. Oftentimes, they're presented at a work session first, and then they're actually formally introduced under resolution, which can move through the process more quickly. We would anticipate if we needed to move on a quicker basis to meet the federal regulations that came out, we would use the quicker process of just making notice that we are working on regulations and then adopting them by resolution.
Okay. And then I think you mentioned this in your presentation when you had the map up of the traffic signals that are owned by the city. There are not that many actually within the city that are owned by the city. You mentioned, I think, that county traffic signals or state traffic signals operated by the county would fall under the county regulation?
Yes, because we don't effectively own the right-of-way. Those would be owned either by the state jurisdiction or the county jurisdiction. Their regulations and their requirements for co-location on their facilities would apply, not our facilities regulations.
And then finally, there were a couple of references to one factor or one standard to consider for applications was if it creates any danger. And I guess we're sort of intentionally leaving that a bit broad because there are all different ways you could create danger depending on what an application says or purports to want to do. But any thoughts on kind of how staff sees that being applied? I mean, aside from, you know, putting too many facilities on top of, you know, a particular pole to make it top heavy, are there other types of dangers? I'm not asking you for an exhaustive list, but other types of dangers that might be considered under this regulatory regime, such as line of sight for traffic flow and things like that?
So most intersections have a sight distance triangle. We would refrain from putting equipment in that sight distance triangle. In addition, because each street's a little bit unique, we would look at where the pole placement is for those types of facilities to making sure that there's clear line of sight, but also that, you know, it's not on a curve that might impede if somebody deviated from the road path, less obstruction there. So those are some of the things that we would consider.
Thank you. That's all I got.
Okay.
Dennis, what's the time frame for regulations governing private property? You'd mentioned that that's not here yet.
We do not currently have a proposal for private property, partly because those are reviewed by the Planning Commission under most considerations. So those are done on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, because I'm hearkening back to the ordinance discussion where I had questions about the ordinance governing placement of poles on private property. I thought Lynn had mentioned that we would seek to govern those more strictly through regulation, and that's why the ordinances weren't quite as detailed.
So these regulations that we're proposing tonight only deal with the right-of-way.
Yep, got that.
So any additional regulations, so if you needed some regulation on stealth facilities, I think was your main question, because that would be allowed by right. Those would need to be developed as part of the Planning Commission packet in terms of their regulations. They would be doing something similar, or could be doing something similar, that they could provide direction as opposed to a regulation. So when they received a request, they could come up with some criteria and then say formally adopt that as the criteria.
But of course, a by right review is much less
Yes.
intrusive than a special exception review. Okay.
Correct.
That it? Okay. Anybody else with questions? Okay, not seeing any. This is the time the mayor and council would like to hear from anybody who'd like to speak on this topic. Same rules apply. State your name and address or neighborhood or business, and who'd like to be our first speaker? Yeah, Aaron, you can come up. Anybody who'd like to speak, feel free to line up behind this gentleman.
Good evening, thank you. My name's Sean Hughes. I'm here from Miller and Canby for T-Mobile from Monroe Street in Rockville. And first of all, I do want to thank, as you guys have done, I think well-deserved staff and everyone involved in this. Our city's done a lot of work, tremendous job. It is a difficult topic. T-Mobile, we have submitted some written comments just recently. Well, I just want to hit on a few points that we want to raise for you all to hear tonight. So, why is T-Mobile continuing to build? Well, they're doing that because their customers are demanding it. And the growth it's years and years we're hearing this data growth is coming. It's here. It's upon us. And Dennis is kind enough. I think he's going to help show a slide if we can. But T-Mobile's growth just in Montgomery County since June of 2014 till end of last month is 1,000% on data usage. That's a huge number. That's because so many of us are using our phones and our tablets and watching videos, watching TV, sending pictures, using calendars. So there is a significant need to not only try to get ahead, but really just try to keep up. And so this shows what I just said and where it's projected to go. And so that's really what we're trying to do. With that in mind, there's a few questions we had, and a few suggestions we're hoping will be considered. First one is we had some questions and concerns about a 500-foot separation. So allowing one carrier on a pole and really just allowing one carrier on a pole. And 500 feet, the idea is these small cells, I've been doing this a long time, we didn't want the tall towers, so come put them on the small poles and have a lot of them. That's what we're trying to do now. But if we're really restricted as to where we can put them, it won't work. If it doesn't work, then the customers aren't happy and they're not able to use it as they would like. The other one is the reserve process. We're still a little unsure how that's benefiting overall the goal, which we think the goal is to provide enhanced wireless services, certainly within parameters, which the city has a right to do. Another really big one for us is the size limits. So the size limits of the equipment are proposed are 1/10 of what the FCC's co-location agreement has proposed. So they're going to be so small that we're not going to be able to provide the service that is needed. There's not going to be sharing here. It's not going to happen the way it's proposed now. And since I'm low on time, I'll just say residential areas. That's where most people want to use their equipment these days. To outright just say we're not even able to go in a residential area, it really just doesn't make a lot of sense to serve the customers. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And any additional comment, you're welcome to submit in writing. We're glad to receive it.
Thank you.
Please.
Good evening again. Once again, Josh Turner, Wiley Ryan, here on behalf of Crown Castle. And I wanted to echo everything my colleague from representing T-Mobile said. As I said before, we're pleased that the city is taking this issue seriously, but we continue to have serious reservations about where we've ended up in this process. We've said from the beginning of this process that the proposed regulations raise serious concerns under federal law because they effectively put a large percentage of the city out of bounds for the kinds of wireless facilities that we need to build for this new generation of wireless service. Talked about the kind of increasing data use that we're seeing that's happening across the industry. And the kinds of facilities that we're going to need to build in order to serve that data use are smaller, they're closer to the customer, and they're higher throughput as a result of that. And they're the kinds of things that we need to serve this new generation of facilities. It's not the old paradigm of the giant stick one place in the town. The revised regulations unfortunately don't address these issues. They continue to impose what we think are unreasonable restrictions on access to certain parts of the city. They also have the spacing requirements, which my colleague talked about, and I think those are very, very difficult to deal with. Again, we're talking about very small facilities that have a very short range. That's actually a feature. That's part of what you want to do. You want to make the cells smaller so that you can have more users on each set of antennas. If you stick to a 500-foot spacing, you are going to essentially ban the kind of new technology that really is exciting in this next 4th generation and 5th generation of wireless service. I think those issues are, and also the other thing I would say is the sizing requirements are also a very big concern for us because we do think that they put a real limitation on our ability to house multiple different carriers in a single facility. And that actually is something that the city, I think, should like because the more co-location you have, the fewer of these things you have to have sort of overall. We also note, and this was mentioned earlier, that the city has used New York City's procedures as a model for some of the more recent changes. And we understand the logic behind doing that, but there are a couple of problems with that. One, we have argued with the city of New York for years about the size limitations that they have. While we have lived with them, we've never really thought that they were workable. Much of what is going on in New York is going to be changed fairly soon. And again, this is one of those circumstances where we'd hate to see you adopt what is essentially an obsolete set of regs that is about to change. And then the second is just size-wise, New York is far larger than here, and the kinds of requirements and procedures that make sense in a city of 8 million people really don't make sense in a city the size of Gaithersburg. So that's really where we are. And again, we applaud you all for taking this issue seriously. We'll probably be submitting additional comments, but that's about all I can get in 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll look forward to additional comments.
My name is Aaron Rosenzweig. I'm from Wesley and teamgaithersburg.org. I want to thank Rob Wu for talking about the cell towers on the tops of roofs. You know, when we incorporate a city, we do it for the purpose of advocating for our citizens' interests, better than we can at the county, better than we can at the state, because we're local. I don't know of any citizen who was asked to put cell towers on top of the roof, so I don't know why this is being put into our regulations. But if we are bent on putting these in our regulations, we need to protect our citizens as best we can. That means when someone sells this home, they must tell the people who buy the home, or tell the people who rent the home, if it's being rented, that there's a cell tower on the roof. Much the same way that if a house is built before 1978, we have to say that there may be lead poisoning in this home. Also, when these kind of things go in, they put a lien on a person's house. It's the same thing as with the solar panels. If someone wants to buy this house, there must be something in regulation, something in legislation that allows them to say, hey, I don't want that on this house, let me buy it. Otherwise, a person who got suckered into it will not be able to sell their house. Additionally, many houses, this is just a way to get around, if they can't put poles 30 feet from our house, they're going to pay somebody to put it on their private property. We should let the public know how much that person's getting paid to put them on public property, just like they should know how much they pay us to put it in the right of way. We should all know how much that person's getting paid. In places like the Kentlands, where the houses are so close together that you can open your window and literally pass the Grey Poupon. If somebody has that on their roof, it's very close to where you are if you're their neighbor. And if you have young children under the age of 5, I know we can't talk about all these health hazards, but, other countries are. And they're real, and we haven't updated everything. They keep talking about people using stuff in residential areas. You know what? In most of our residential areas, we all got fiber. We have plenty of bandwidth to do whatever we want inside our homes. The only purpose this would serve is when we're walking our dog to look at some high-definition video. And do we really need to do that? We've got plenty of bandwidth in our homes. I know you guys want to make money, and it's great that you want to make money, but let me tell you, I don't like your condescending attitude and the way you make us act like we're not that smart.
Aaron, please address us, please.
Where is that written anywhere, Mayor? I'm serious. We don't scare,
Aaron,
and we're not dumb.
Aaron, please address us. You're testifying to us.
I'm testifying to everyone in this room. And there's nothing written that I can't turn around and talk to people, Mayor. Show me where that's written.
It's actually in the charter. It says the mayor presides over the council hearings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
My name is Bob Mitchell on Turnham Court again. Some of our discussion here seems to be extremely practical and not necessarily confined to the usual kinds of regulations that you people work on. The representative from Crown Castle is essentially saying, we really do have a service that we need to provide to you. And I'm saying, what's the basis for you saying that you need to provide me a service? I don't have very many people talking about the services that they need to provide me. Usually, they talk about services they want me to want. And while we're being very practical, I think a lot about the future of our neighborhoods and our families. I read now that kids no longer read books. If anything is over 2 paragraphs, forget it. They don't look at it. They spend their time on social media, which is at least 65% snooping and another 30% bragging, and it seems to get us into trouble. I'm not sure we always go in the right direction automatically. So I'm hopeful that as you think about these things, that you find it possible to think about a wider range of considerations than some of them that we've been going through. Thank you.
Thank you. Come on up, please.
If I could snap some right. Good evening again, Mayor, Council. M.G. Diamond with the law offices of M. Greg Diamond in Bethesda, Maryland, 7500 Woodmont Ave. On behalf of Selco Partnership, doing business as Verizon Wireless, 3 minutes is obviously not a time in which you could get into the great details of this ordinance, of the regulations, but let's talk conceptually. The city's one-size-fits-all approach to small wireless is not a successful way to actually implement the technology. It may be a legal way to implement an ordinance, but it won't be a successful engineering way to implement the technology. I think if you could conceptualize this as viewing it as commercial zones versus neighborhoods in terms of the size of the equipment needed. Your commercial zones with wider roads and much denser traffic capacity is similarly needs radio traffic capacity at that higher, wider level. Your neighborhoods need smaller capacity, and the equipment can be smaller. One size fits all really doesn't make it, or excluding whole parts of the city. Again, from an engineering perspective of making the system work, won't be successful. As drafted, the city really only addresses what Verizon Wireless would think of as micro wireless. The equipment is so small, that the equipment that drives the antennas is so small that what happens is if you were starting from a city that had no wireless services whatsoever, perhaps a micro wireless approach might do, because those radio signals won't be competing with anything else. But when you start with a mature provider of services that has macro cells all in and around the city, and then you try to implement micro cells, there is a problem there of competition and interference, which is probably getting too far into the problem, except that effectively you're passing regulations that won't be implemented by the industry because these regulations won't work. Let me just say, for Verizon Wireless, I've set forth the numbers that based on meetings I had with the radio engineers today, that would work for implementation of small wireless services. In your denser areas, in your denser parts of the city, your commercial districts, Verizon Wireless can work with a 4.5 foot tall antenna and 15 cubic feet in their what we call a cantenna, an antenna hidden in a cylinder. The equipment space needs up to 15 cubic feet. In the smaller, in residential areas, what Verizon Wireless would want to see is 4.5 feet and 6 cubic feet at a time.
We understand.
But
thank you.
The numbers are in the handout.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other speakers tonight on the regulations? Going once, going twice. Okay. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I just had a question with respect to the gentleman's point regarding regulating disparately between commercial zones, neighborhood zones. I guess Joe or Lynn, or early on in the discussion, that point was brought up, and I thought the rub on that is you can't regulate the right-of-ways differently per zone because it's one rights of way.
No, I don't think if we got that impression, I think that's not correct. But I think you have a different situation. One is you have a lot of county roads that go through some of the areas that are the wider roads, in fact. So some of those are actually taken care of because the Montgomery County regulations are going to apply to those wider roads. The other thing that happens in commercial areas is you have buildings, almost by definition, as you do right down here, where there may be alternative locations on the building or on rooftops. So then the question becomes, do you want to make that distinction? But conceivably, you could allow larger antennas in commercial areas if it fit in with the design of that commercial area. I'm not sure that the commercial areas, in some cities I would say that's definitely the case. The commercial areas are designed differently than everything else. I'm not so sure that's true here.
I think the question I asked early on was, I can see something being appropriate for the Crowns and the Rios that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for the Westleys or the West Ridings. And the impression I got from the conversation was if we allowed stuff of a certain character into the Crowns and the Rios, it would have to bleed over to the rights of way in other parts of the city. But
When we looked at how we were going to do the classifications or where they would be allowed, we actually looked at safety and the width of the right-of-way as one of the contributing factors. So those streets that are major arterials, collectors, and minor arterials actually have more right-of-way. So we're capable of having more equipment within the right-of-way. Again, we're not just talking about small cell facilities, we're talking about all equipment in the right-of-way. So the more equipment you add to the right-of-way, the more complex it gets to be in terms of meeting all the safety requirements and making sure you can actually fit all the underground utility associated with those facilities. Again, you can't put above ground utility lines up, so you're servicing all these facilities through underground cables, electric. There's only so much width of the right-of-way that you can fit that in, and so we really did look at the street classification as opposed to zoning classification, because that seemed the most appropriate from the width standpoint, and that's how we developed the map. Keeping in mind some of the areas that are kind of shown as checkerboard and major, these still allow, under the county regulations or the state regulations, would allow co-location of facilities on their own facilities, not located within our right-of-way. In addition, as pointed out, we have a number of mixed-use areas, so the zoning isn't divided into residential, commercial. It's really a mixed-use development. In fact, all our new developments don't have that classification as residential, commercial separated out. They're actually just one zoning as an MXD. So we couldn't use that as the basis either, because places like Kentlands Boulevard that are more high-trafficked areas really are more MXD zoned as opposed to straight Euclidean zoning. So we went to the road classification for those reasons, primarily safety and the width of the right-of-way, but also there is no way to do it from a zoning standpoint. And again, we don't apply zoning to the right-of-way, so it didn't also seem appropriate.
But even within a mixed-use community, Kentlands or Crown, you have a real, there's a clear differentiation between a residential part of the community as opposed to the more dense urbanized part of the community. So I guess the question is how flexible, given these regulations, there's flexibility to allow different types of antennas or different facilities, a distinction between the types of facilities that would go in the urbanized part of the community as opposed to the residential single-family home parts of the community. Is that?
We did not treat them any differently in terms of the road classification. So if they're under the road classifications of collector, arterial, or minor collector, the regulations apply equally through all of those. So
that's how the distinction that's how that happens then, because the residential areas are not major arterials.
Yeah, there are
more narrow streets and okay.
There are residential areas that are collector streets.
Right.
So for instance,
Shafali, right?
You know, Shafali
Shafali
would be
is
a
one
great
example.
example that really has no commercial on it.
Right.
There are also other portions within the community that are very similar to that. Teacher's Way, for example, is considered one of those areas that would allow that. So it's again based on the road classification. not necessarily based upon the use that's surrounding it.
So are we satisfied that our road classification is accurate in
Yes.
representing the actual uses of those roads in terms of
This is the
these issues?
classification that we've adopted
Okay.
under our master plan.
All right.
Or the best way to do it. Because harkening back to the April 16 presentation where I went down this line of questioning, you had the one picture of the 30-foot thick pole in the middle of the yard, and there was the white minivan parked out front. And then you had another one that looked like the Crown type environment. I think it was actually placed in front of the Ziff dry cleaner. And my question was, along the lines of what Mr. Diamond is talking about is, some of these uses seem more appropriate for a higher density area where you're going to have more patrons versus sticking a big pole in the middle of a front yard with a white minivan parked right next to it. So just throwing that out as food for thought as to, rather than doing a one-size-fits-all, thinking about the propriety of uses, the densities around the city and whatnot.
I think the issue is that we don't have that choice. The right-of-way is the right-of-way regardless of where it is. And so the regulations have to be consistent across.
Well, that's what I thought the
in all
original
of
answer
these.
was, but it
Right.
sounds,
That's
what Joe
Joe
is
just
saying.
said that's not the case.
That's
Not
not
the
the
You could make different you could make more granular distinctions between parts of the rights of way based on size or based on the types of uses around the rights of way. The question is, in looking at whether that makes sense, is how is the community actually planned out? What's actually there? Does it make any sense given the types of mixed uses or commercial uses you've got going on? And recognizing that in some cases, the industrial areas, the commercial areas may be served either by interior DAS systems, that is systems that are inside of office buildings, that's the way they provide coverage, or by larger towers because they're not high density uses in the same way they're trying to reach residential areas with things that can allow you to watch TV. So it's actually not clear. So the idea was you've got to think about just how the problem fits in.
Yeah, well, but
to
those
your
are factual
neighborhoods.
permutations based on what realistically is there, and the only comment I would have is to make sure the regulations provide the flexibility to address the density type issues. More
Mhm.
people are around, they want more cell phone service, so you want to be,
Which I believe we have based upon the road classification,
Okay.
because
That
that's
was-
where the
and that was
denser
my
parts of
question.
the city would be, whether they be mixed use or commercial areas. So the other thing to keep in mind is there is still some variation. It's not one size fits all. So if Faley Square has different heights of streetlights than you would find on Washington Boulevard.
That's right.
Right.
You know,
That was
Washington
gonna be my
Boulevard's gonna be 35 feet as their box light,
Mhm.
but Faley Square is not gonna be at that height. So there is variation within those categories based upon what the profile of that street actually looks like.
just want to make sure we're thinking about it. Thanks.
It seems we are. Okay. So, two things. We'll go through our record, and then I'd like to ask Joe to give us an update on FCC actions pending. So-
Could I have just kind of like a closing comment in
Please.
terms of the
Sure.
public
Go right ahead.
comments? We would like, we have tried to work with the industry with regard to the regulations, and we're hoping that they will provide specifics to the regulations instead of generalities. So if you think the size equipment is not the right size, we need proposed size equipment. We also did an outreach in terms of saying, can you show us models that work for you? And we'd look at trying to incorporate those into the regulations as things that would be approved automatically in terms of going through the process, so they would know ahead of time. We have not received any of those to date, and we would really encourage the industry and the public to do that, to make their comments specific, because we have to then turn around and make the changes to the regulations within a short period of time.
Okay, to all the attorneys in the room, I hope that you've gotten that message. Thank you very much, Dennis. So staff recommends that we hold the record open until 5 p.m. on October 31st. Final policy discussion and possible adoption tentatively scheduled for December 18th. What's the pleasure of the council?
Moved.
Seconded.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that carries 5-0. Joe, tell us about the FCC.
Okay, you have, as you know from hearing from me before, there are 3 active proceedings before the FCC, where the FCC is investigating what steps it should take, if any, to speed deployment of wireless and wireline facilities across the country. You've been a participant in all 3 of those proceedings. The commission also has a different process going on, which it calls the BDAC process, which is the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, which is a set of folks appointed by the chairman who are directed to come up with model ordinances for state level and model ordinances for local level, and to identify barriers to entry that the commission might want to think about adopting regs to eliminate. That, I think the commission recognizes, and I think even the members of that committee recognize, that it is highly tilted toward the industry. There is one person from a city on the committee that's supposed to come up with model ordinances for cities. A problem that I see from looking at sort of your regulations, there's very few people who are involved from AASHTO, the safety group, the groups that are involved in highway safety and design. They just are not even represented. So you've got someone writing regulations and ordinances that are supposed to be models without the folks on the table who actually deal with those from day to day. Nonetheless, that process is going forward, and the committees are directed to come up with solutions, proposed recommendations on those items, barriers, state regulation, local regulation models, on November 9th. We expect, although this is just guesswork, that once that process is completed, the FCC may commence additional proceedings, or it may proceed to take that information and fold it into its decision-making on the 3 pending proceedings, which would mean likely sometime early next year, you could get a set of new FCC regulations. So the question, to go back to some of the comments that were made earlier, is there any reason to adopt these detailed regulations? The answer is yes, because you actually have applications pending. We don't know what the FCC will do, and what the FCC does will always be subject to challenge and amendment. It does make it a good idea to adopt a procedure for regulating small cells that can be changed rather quickly, because you may have to revisit the issue. But there's no benefit to waiting at this stage.
We have pre-applications pending. Do we have any applications pending?
You're right. We don't have any applications pending at this point.
Thank you.
You're
Okay.
correct.
Thank you.
For
We don't
correcting
even have
that.
any pre-application.
No.
So pre-application.
Yeah, I
What's the
didn't think we
danger
did,
of,
and that was part
But I
of
still take
before.
Joe's point,
Yeah.
and I agree with it. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, no one currently has a franchise agreement to actually do this, so there are no applications pre or existing.
Okay.
What's the danger of preemption in this at the national level?
Yes, there is a danger of preemption at the national level. You should also be aware that at the state level, I believe 13...
It's already happened in Texas and a couple,
Yeah,
few
and
other states.
California just passed the legislature, it has not been signed by the governor, adopting some of the size, mandating essentially that some of the sizes that are proposed in some of the industry comments be accepted, be treated as a permitted use in zoning districts.
California.
California, yes.
Anything on the horizon in Maryland?
Yeah.
I believe that it will, I don't know what the
Not that I
situation
don't
is in
care
Maryland
about
at this
Texas,
point.
but I care about Maryland.
Yeah, Maryland, you should be watching it closely. I don't think there's anything pending. There are some other issues, telecommunications issues, that will come up in the next session, I think.
And I will add that the Maryland Municipal League's Legislative Committee just voted to make this issue one of their top legislative priorities to watch in the coming session. So it's one of 3 priorities that MML is likely to be focusing on.
I know the Texas League of Cities has focused on preemption in a number of issues. This is one of them. The National League of Cities is moving on this as well as part of the national municipal policy. So dealing with preemption in general, but also in this specific area. So it is a concern among municipal governments.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. All right. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming to testify.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to from the mayor and council, and we're going to start with Councilmember Rob Wu.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I don't have much to say other than I'm a T-Mobile customer, and Garrett Park could really use a tower. It's a dead spot. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right. We'll move on to
The Mark Station. The Mark Station.
We'll move on to Mike Sesma.
Don't have much to add. Nobody cares who I get my service from anyway. So I would just like to say last week on Friday morning, we had the principal, counselors, and PTA presidents annual breakfast. I think it's the 12th or the 13th annual breakfast. Another great event. It was featured a local young man, Quince Orchard graduate, and a Georgetown student now. Former football player and I think he's still a member of the football team at Georgetown, football player at QO, Ty Williams.
Yep.
Gave us a nice keynote for that, and I think the new format that they implemented this year, the Educational Enrichment Committee, they should be congratulated on that. I think it provided some real opportunities to meet with community partners to carry out their mission with their students and their school communities. So it was a nice event. That's really all I have. Just reminded people about Oktoberfest on Sunday.
Yeah.
Sunday.
Thank you. Ryan.
Thank you. Formal announcement, Gaithersburg residents will cast their ballots for mayor and 2 city council members on Tuesday, November 7th, 2017. And the distribution of absentee ballot applications and ballots will begin on Friday, October 6th. That's this Friday. The last day to register to vote in the 2017 city elections is Monday, October 23rd. If you are already registered to vote in Montgomery County for county, state, or federal elections at your Gaithersburg city address, then you are automatically already registered to vote in city elections. But to confirm your registration, you can contact the Montgomery County Board of Elections at 240-777-VOTE. For complete election information, go to www.gaithersburgmd.gov/government/elections. Or you can contact Elections Clerk Lauren Klingler at 301-258-6310, or send an email to cityelections@gaithersburgmd.gov. And just one personal comment, Mr. Mayor, to piggyback off of your comments at the beginning of the meeting about the events in Las Vegas. And just speaking for myself and not for the city, I just want to say that I think sending thoughts and prayers is simply not enough. And we need to continue to pursue reasonable regulations on firearms and to continue investing in mental health research and the provision of mental health care. And I think also to try to foster more cultural and social interaction between our fellow human beings in a way that builds connections and not divisions, and that heals wounds instead of letting them fester or worsen. A few weeks ago at our council meeting, in the context of the impending hurricanes, I also talked about the importance of emergency response and preparedness for local governments. And obviously that factor too is ever more salient in light of the events in Las Vegas. Now there's obviously no guarantee that you could ever prevent this sort of horrific catastrophe, no matter what things you do or how much you try. And we don't know very much yet about the cause of this latest massacre, but if we could afford to reduce the risk of such events in any meaningful way in the future, then I think we owe it to our communities, we owe it to the victims, and we owe it to our common humanity to do what we can. And I just wanted to say those comments tonight because I was feeling very strongly about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Neil.
Okay, so I wanted to mention that this morning was the inauguration of the new Ride-On Express bus service that is running up and down 355 from between Medical Center in Bethesda and the Lake Forest Mall Transit Center here in Gaithersburg. There are only 12 stops versus something like 80 stops for a normal bus following that same route. We saw the buses today. They're very nice. They have Wi-Fi and USB plug-in so you can keep your phone charged. little TV screens. It's hard to say what's going to make traffic better, but all the things that we're trying, let's see how they go. Governor Hogan announced within the last couple of weeks his intention to widen the major highways around here. There are good points and bad points for that, but again, I think we need to do something to get traffic moving, and all the things that we're going to try, we'll find out if they work. The ride-on express bus service on 355 is free for the next month, so worth giving it a try. It's not very expensive. It's only $2 a ride once we get past this month, but let's see if we can't get some people off the road and keep people moving. I want to echo the comment about Oktoberfest coming up. Looking forward to it. It's always a great event. 20 or 30,000 people. Over the last several years, it's been spread out over much more of the Kentlands, so that there's much more entertainment and much more elbow room. It was getting a little cramped putting 20,000 people in 2 square blocks a few years ago, and really looking forward to a beautiful fall day and lots of entertainment and good food and maybe a beer or two along the way. There's also a candidates forum coming up on the 11th of this month in the Kentlands Clubhouse. I'd like to encourage city residents to attend or at least view over the stream that they'll put out over the internet. I know several people up here on the dais will be on the hot seat, which is it's always fun to not be there and get to watch and listen to people ask questions, so I think that'll be great. Number of other events coming up. I'm looking forward to the Fuller Institute's Economic Forum at George Mason University this Wednesday morning. There's always good data coming out about what's actually happening and been measured in the economy of the DC metro region, and Steve Fuller always has good suggestions for what we ought to be doing in order to make things better for all of us. I'll keep it at that today since we've had a pretty long meeting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. Yvette.
Thank you, Mayor. Just want to thank staff for their presentations tonight, and I just concur with everybody. Thank you to the Education Enrichment Committee, put on a terrific event on Friday. That's all.
All right. I want to congratulate staff and thank everybody involved in planning the annual staff picnic. It was a terrific event in a new venue, and they did a really great job with it. Also wanted to thank everybody from the book festival and everybody who attended the terrific author event we had last week. Set a record for attendance for a single author for the book festival. We had 730 people out to see Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She was a rock star. It was great. We'll keep you posted on any future book festival events, and hope everyone's saving the date for May 19th. The next week, our work session, we'll be receiving annual committee briefings from the Environmental Affairs, Multicultural Affairs, and Transportation Committees. So that's next Monday, October 9th. And we will move on to from the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll also keep it brief. Just one item. In the strategic plan, there's specific objectives to invest in and maintain technology to gain efficiencies and improve operational effectiveness. Just coincidentally, we have a lot of things going on. In the short term, you're going to get another update from the GIS department on some of the new maps and utilities that they've been working on, which have taken the program even further than you saw last year. We did just execute a contract for the police criminal intelligence and tracking system that's been in the CIP for a couple years, which they've been looking forward to. Even the new budget software is going to be a tremendous change to how we construct the budget and how you get to review and approve it next year. We have, I think, over 80 of our 270 employees are involved in that, and will receive multiple days of training on the new software package. And I'm personally going to attend the Smart Cities Week. I know somebody got me a free ticket, but I forget who. I think it might have been Ryan or Neil or Mike. Somebody did.
It was, through COG.
Through Council of Governments. So I'll be down there looking for other opportunities to bring to you guys next budget cycle.
Great. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to economic development update. Tom Lonigan. And thank you for your patience in waiting this out.
It's been a pleasure. I had several items tonight. I'll limit it to one with with your okay tonight. St. Gobain Performance Plastics, you may be familiar with them, is now 7,000 square feet larger than it was just a few months ago. The biotech company signed a lease that expands its city presence into 401 Professional Drive. Company leased a pair of suites with Alexandria Real Estate that gives it expansion room beyond its main operation at 50 West Watkins Mill. You may recall that they moved into about 37,000 square feet over there just last year, supported in part with an Opportunities Fund grant by the city. Happy, of course, to see them expanding in Gaithersburg, and additional comments will be in 2 weeks.
So what are they putting in the new facility? Are they building more robot factory stuff like they have in the other one?
They haven't told me if that's what their secret plan is, but I know it's lab and office.
Yeah, it was a super impressive facility.
It sure is.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Good work.
All right. From the city attorney.
Yeah, I think you've heard enough from me this evening, so nothing further.
Anything from anyone else?
We enjoyed everything you had to say.
Yes. Okay. So as mentioned, join us next week for a work session, receiving those committee briefings. Next regular meeting of Mayor and Council is 2 weeks from now on October 16th, and we hope to see everyone at Oktoberfest. Until next time, let's do great things, Gaithersburg. We are adjourned.